What if the world you trust is built upon secrets even science cannot explain? Deep within sealed archives, collapsing ruins, and frozen deserts, evidence keeps appearing that should not exist. Scientists have spent decades chasing anomalies that rewrite history, only to find contradictions that deepen with every answer. And between what is buried and what erased, reality begins to fracture, forcing us to confront what was never meant to be seen. Tonight we uncover the truth hidden behind the impossible. Off the eastern edge of the Mediterranean, where the sea narrows between ancient coastlines and shifting winds, the waters around Tyre and Sidon have long carried more than trade routes and fishing vessels. Beneath its surface lies a silence that once may have held one of the most ambitious maritime forces of the ancient world, the Phoenician fleet. Known in antiquity for their unmatched seafaring skill, the Phoenicians built ships that moved along the coasts of North Africa, the Iberian Peninsula, and possibly beyond the Strait of Gibraltar, carrying cedar wood, dyed textiles, glass, and precious metals. Historical records from Greek and Egyptian sources describe them as master navigators, traders who read the stars and currents with a precision that inspired both admiration and suspicion. Their ships were not merely vessels of commerce. They were extensions of a civilization that thrived on movement, exchange, and maritime dominance. Yet within fragments of ancient accounts and later interpretations, there are hints, uncertain, incomplete, that some fleets departed and never returned. Unlike many well-documented naval losses caused by storms or conflict, the story of a missing treasure fleet of the Phoenicians does not appear as a single recorded event in surviving archives. Instead, it emerges indirectly through gaps, disrupted trade records, abandoned coastal stations, and sudden absences in regional correspondence during periods of known maritime activity. These absences leave behind a quiet but persistent question. What happened to the ships that should have arrived, but did not? Mainstream archaeology suggests practical explanations. The ancient Mediterranean was unforgiving. Sudden storms could scatter fleets. Naval warfare between competing city-states could erase entire convoys. Even piracy, well attested in ancient texts, posed a constant threat to merchant vessels carrying valuable cargo. Wooden ships, no matter how well constructed, were vulnerable to the sea's unpredictability and the limitations of ancient navigation. Yet the Phoenicians were not ordinary sailors. Their reputation suggests organization, redundancy, and experience accumulated over centuries. This is what makes the absence of clear evidence for a catastrophic loss of a major fleet particularly intriguing. There are no definitive wreck clusters, no singular archaeological horizon marking a large-scale maritime disaster attributed to them. Instead, there are scattered anomalies, isolated Phoenician artifacts found far from expected trade routes, sometimes in contexts that challenge straightforward explanations of how they arrived there. This has led some researchers and independent historians to consider alternative possibilities, not as conclusions, but as speculative frameworks. One idea proposes that certain fleets may have ventured far beyond known Mediterranean waters, possibly pushed by seasonal winds or exploratory ambitions, never returning due to unknown maritime conditions or navigational miscalculations. Another suggestion, more cautious in academic circles, is that records of such voyages may have been lost or absorbed into later cultural narratives, their details blurred by time and translation. There are also interpretations that emphasize the symbolic nature of Phoenician trade itself. In this view, lost fleets may not refer to a single disappearance, but to the gradual dissolution of maritime networks over centuries, as political shifts in the eastern Mediterranean altered trade dynamics and absorbed independent city-states into larger empires. What appears as absence may instead be transformation, records fading not because ships vanished suddenly, but because the systems that recorded them changed. Still, questions persist in the gaps between these explanations. Why do some coastal sites show abrupt discontinuities in Phoenician material culture? Why do certain ancient maritime references describe long-distance voyages with uncertain outcomes, leaving no clear record of return? And how much of what is missing reflects lost history, rather than lost ships? The sea preserves little in certainty. It erases wood, corrodes metal, and reshapes stories over centuries. What remains is interpretation, layered, incomplete, and constantly revised as new evidence emerges from underwater excavations and re-examinations of ancient texts. And so the mystery of the Phoenician maritime world remains suspended between history and silence. Were these missing fleets simply casualties of an unpredictable ancient ocean, or are they fragments of a broader story that has yet to be fully reconstructed? Before moving to the next mystery, if you love deep dives into mysteries like this, I put together an entire ebook dedicated to the hidden secrets of ancient Egypt. The Egypt they don't cover in school, don't show in museums, and don't explain in mainstream documentaries. The link is right below this video. Now, let's get into the next mystery. Continuing from the fragile silence surrounding the fate of Phoenician fleets in the Mediterranean, the story naturally shifts westward, toward the narrow passage where the known world once seemed to end. At the far edge of the Mediterranean, beyond the rocky pillars that the ancients called the boundaries of the sea, lies the Strait of Gibraltar. Even today it remains a dramatic threshold. Europe on one side, North Africa on the other, and beyond it, the vast Atlantic Ocean opening into an expanse that must have felt limitless to ancient mariners. For the Phoenicians, this was not just a boundary, it was a gateway. Historical accounts from Greek and later Roman writers suggest that Phoenician sailors from cities such as Tyre and Sidon did not stop at the Pillars of Hercules. Instead, they ventured beyond them, following coastlines southward along West Africa and northward toward the Atlantic islands. Archaeological and textual evidence supports their presence in places like the Iberian Peninsula, where colonies such as Gadir, modern Cadiz, became important hubs of maritime trade. From there, the question begins to widen. How far did their voyages truly extend? Mainstream history confirms that Phoenician navigation was remarkably advanced for its time. They relied on coastal piloting, star patterns, and an intimate understanding of winds and currents. Their ships, typically biremes and merchant vessels with reinforced hulls, were capable of long-distance travel along predictable maritime routes. The Atlantic, however, introduced variables that the Mediterranean did not: powerful tides, unpredictable storms, and vast stretches of open water without visual reference points. Yet there are fragments in ancient sources that hint at voyages pushing into this uncertainty. Herodotus, writing centuries later, describes Phoenician sailors commissioned by an Egyptian pharaoh to circumnavigate Africa. According to his account, they sailed south through the Red Sea, eventually returning through the Pillars of Hercules after a journey that took several years. While modern scholars debate the accuracy of this narrative, it remains one of the earliest references to extended maritime exploration possibly linked to Phoenician navigators. Beyond this, there are quieter, less certain traces. Ancient trade goods found along the Atlantic coasts of Iberia and North Africa suggest sustained maritime contact. Some interpretations propose that Phoenician sailors may have reached the Canary Islands, drawn by seasonal winds and currents. The islands themselves, while never definitively tied to Phoenician settlement in the archaeological record, have long been part of speculative discussions due to their position along natural Atlantic drift routes. Then there are the more distant hypotheses, carefully separated from established historical consensus, but persistent in alternative interpretations. Some suggest that Phoenician navigation knowledge, combined with favorable Atlantic currents such as the Canary Current and North Equatorial Drift, could theoretically have carried ships far beyond the Western African coastline. Others point to similarities in certain ancient cultural symbols and maritime artifacts as indirect clues of contact across greater distances. These ideas remain speculative, lacking definitive archaeological confirmation, yet they continue to appear in discussions about the limits of ancient seafaring capability. What complicates the picture is not only distance, but survival. Organic materials do not endure well in Atlantic conditions. Wooden hulls disintegrate, cargo disperses, and coastal erosion reshapes ancient landing sites. Even if such voyages occurred, the ocean itself would have erased much of the physical record, leaving only fragments in texts, indirect references, and patterns of trade that hint at wider movement. At the same time, we must consider the possibility that what appears as extraordinary exploration may have been more incremental. The Phoenicians were not driven by conquest in the same way as later empires, but by trade networks that expanded gradually through familiarity and necessity. Each new coastline reached would have been mapped not as a bold discovery, but as an extension of known routes passed from one generation of sailors to the next. Still, the Atlantic represents something qualitatively different from the Mediterranean world. It is vast, open, and unpredictable. Even experienced mariners would have found its scale humbling. If Phoenician ships did venture deeply into these waters, what motivated them to risk such journeys? Was it pursuit of metals, trade opportunities, or something less documented? Perhaps knowledge, exploration, or the extension of maritime understanding beyond familiar limits? And if they did not reach as far as some theories propose, why do certain ancient echoes suggest otherwise? Moving from the open uncertainty of Atlantic horizons back toward the interior highlands of the ancient Near East, the narrative turns to a land of stone fortresses, volcanic ridges, and windswept plateaus. Here, around Lake Van, in what is now eastern Anatolia, once stood the kingdom of Urartu, a powerful Iron Age civilization that flourished roughly between the 9th and 6th centuries BC. Carved into rugged terrain and defended by imposing citadels such as Tushpa, Urartu was a kingdom defined by engineering precision and military strength. Its kings recorded victories in cuneiform inscriptions, detailing campaigns, irrigation projects, and the construction of fortified cities. Archaeological discoveries reveal a society skilled in metallurgy, capable of producing intricate bronzework, weaponry, and ceremonial objects that reflected both authority and religious devotion. Yet among these remains lies a quieter, more elusive question. What became of Urartu's greatest treasures? Unlike some ancient civilizations whose material wealth was gradually dispersed through trade or conquest, Urartu appears in the historical record with a relatively abrupt disappearance. By the early 6th century BC, references to the kingdom begin to fade, replaced by the expanding influence of neighboring powers. The Urartian language disappears from inscriptions. Fortresses are abandoned or repurposed, and the royal centers that once controlled vast regional networks fall into silence. Mainstream historical interpretation suggests that Urartu's decline was the result of a combination of external pressure and internal fragmentation. Invasions by the Medes and later the expansion of the Achaemenid Empire reshaped the political landscape of the region. Over time, Urartian administrative systems were absorbed or dismantled, and its cultural identity gradually dissolved into surrounding populations. But while political collapse can explain the end of a state, it does not fully account for the question of its material legacy. Urartu was known for its wealth in metals, bronze, iron, and precious objects used in ritual and royal display. Inscriptions and archaeological sites suggest the existence of treasuries stored within fortified complexes and temple precincts. Yet large-scale discoveries of centralized royal hoards remain surprisingly limited. This absence has led historians and archaeologists to consider several possibilities. One straightforward explanation is redistribution. As cities fell or were absorbed, treasures may have been looted, melted down, or integrated into the economies of successor states. In ancient warfare, victory often meant not preservation but transformation. Objects of prestige recast into new forms, their origins obscured over time. Another interpretation focuses on geography and destruction. The Urartian heartland is a seismically active region. Earthquakes, fires, and structural collapses could have buried storage chambers deep within ruins that remain partially unexplored. Some citadels have only been excavated in limited sections, leaving large areas still unexamined beneath layers of debris and time. It is possible that significant portions of material culture remain hidden, not lost in disappearance, but inaccessibility. There are also more interpretive theories that emerge from gaps in the archaeological record rather than direct evidence. Some scholars have suggested that certain Urartian treasures may have been deliberately relocated during periods of instability, moved to secondary sites, or hidden in remote mountain refuges. Others consider the possibility that later cultures, encountering Urartian artifacts, reattributed or repurposed them, effectively dissolving their original cultural context. In the absence of complete records, even the concept of treasure becomes fluid. What constituted wealth in Urartu was not only material but symbolic, objects tied to kingship, divine authority, and state identity. If these items were dispersed, reused, or recontextualized over centuries, their original significance would be difficult to trace, even if fragments physically survived. Archaeological work in the region continues to uncover fortifications, inscriptions, and ceremonial sites, each adding detail to the broader picture of Urartian civilization. Yet the absence of a clearly defined repository of royal wealth remains notable. It is not a void that points to a single explanation, but rather a pattern of dispersal, silence, and incomplete recovery. And so the question persists: did the greatest treasures of Urartu vanish through destruction, assimilation, or simply the slow erosion of time and memory? Or are they still concealed beneath the layered remains of a kingdom whose full material story has yet to be uncovered, waiting in the highlands where stone and history are equally difficult to read? Continuing from the fragmented legacy of Urartu in the highlands of eastern Anatolia, the narrative shifts northward and westward into the vast steppe regions that once formed the unstable frontier between settled kingdoms and nomadic worlds. Here, in the blurred boundary between Europe and Asia, ancient sources speak of a people who left behind far less than they once dominated: the Cimmerians. Described by Greek historians such as Herodotus, the Cimmerians appear as a shadowed force of the early 1st millennium BC, nomadic groups who moved through the Pontic steppe north of the Black Sea, before being displaced by the expansion of the Scythians. Unlike settled civilizations with stone cities and written archives, the Cimmerians existed primarily through the accounts of others, their own voice absent from the historical record. And yet, within those limited references, there is a recurring implication that at some point in their movement across the steppe, the Cimmerians may have possessed or established a central seat of power, sometimes interpreted by modern historians as a capital, or at least a major political and military center. Its exact nature, however, remains uncertain, and its location entirely unknown. The steppe itself offers few clues. It is a landscape defined by movement rather than permanence: rolling grasslands, shifting river courses, and seasonal migration routes that leave minimal enduring architectural traces. If a capital city or fortified settlement existed, it would likely have been constructed from materials such as wood, earth, and organic structures that do not easily survive millennia. This alone complicates any attempt at archaeological confirmation. Mainstream historical interpretation suggests that the Cimmerians were not organized around a fixed capital in the way later kingdoms were. Instead, they may have operated as a confederation of tribes, with leadership centers shifting according to military campaigns and seasonal movement. Their presence in Anatolia, documented in Assyrian records during the 8th and 7th centuries BC, reflects a pattern of migration and conflict rather than stable territorial governance. Assyrian inscriptions describe Cimmerian incursions into regions of Urartu and Anatolia, sometimes portraying them as destabilizing forces in the wider Near Eastern political landscape. These accounts, however, focus more on their movements and raids than on any centralized political structure. This absence of detail raises a subtle question. Were the Cimmerians truly without a capital, or has the evidence of such a center simply been lost to time? Some interpretations suggest that if a Cimmerian political nucleus did exist, it may have been temporary, shifting with the dynamics of warfare and migration. In such a model, capital would not refer to a fixed city, but to a mobile command structure, encampments that functioned as administrative hubs, dissolving and reforming as the tribe moved across vast distances. This would leave almost no archaeological footprint in the conventional sense. Other, more speculative perspectives consider whether traces of such a center might still exist but remain unrecognized. Earthworks or burial mounds across the Eurasian steppe sometimes reveal complex construction patterns that resist easy cultural attribution. Some researchers have cautiously explored whether certain unidentified sites could correspond to early nomadic power centers, though definitive connections to the Cimmerians remain unproven. There is also the broader question of how ancient societies are defined by the records that survive them. The Cimmerians are known largely through the lens of external observers: Assyrian scribes, Greek historians, and later classical writers. If those perspectives emphasized movement and conflict over settlement and structure, it may have shaped how the Cimmerians are understood today. What is absent from the record may reflect not absence itself, but the limitations of observation. As archaeological work continues across the Black Sea region and Eurasian steppe, new discoveries occasionally reshape understanding of early nomadic cultures. Yet no site has been conclusively identified as a Cimmerian capital, and the possibility remains that such a place, if it existed in a recognizable form at all, has been erased by time, geography, and the impermanence of steppe architecture. And so the question lingers quietly across the grasslands they once traversed. Did the Cimmerians ever build a true center of power that could be called a capital, or was their strength always meant to exist in motion, leaving no fixed point for history to anchor itself to? Continuing from the uncertain legacy of the Cimmerians drifting across the Eurasian steppe, the narrative gradually turns southward, toward the highlands and valleys of ancient western Iran, where early Median power began to take shape in the shadow of Assyria. Here, between rugged mountain ranges and fertile plains, lies the historical heartland associated with the Medes, an Iranian people who rose to prominence in the early 1st millennium BC. Ancient sources describe them as a confederation of tribes that eventually consolidated into a powerful kingdom, one that played a crucial role in the collapse of Assyrian dominance in the region. Yet despite their political significance, one of the most persistent uncertainties surrounding them is not their rise, but the disappearance of their earliest royal tombs. The Medes did not leave behind the kind of monumental royal necropolises seen in later imperial cultures. Unlike the carefully documented burial complexes of successor empires, early Median royal sites remain elusive in the archaeological record. Classical accounts, particularly from Greek historians such as Herodotus, suggest the existence of Median kings whose reigns predated the more visible imperial structures that followed. These rulers, according to tradition, established dynastic authority in Ecbatana, modern-day Hamadan, a city described as having concentric defensive walls and a strong royal presence. Yet, when archaeologists examine the region today, the evidence for clearly identifiable royal tombs from the earliest Median period is surprisingly limited. Excavations in and around ancient Ecbatana have revealed layers of occupation from later periods, but no definitively confirmed burial complexes that can be attributed with certainty to the first Median kings. This absence raises a quiet but persistent question. Where were these rulers laid to rest? Mainstream historical interpretation offers several possibilities. One explanation is that Median burial practices did not emphasize monumental tomb construction in the early stages of their political development. Instead, elites may have been interred in less conspicuous forms, earth graves, modest chamber tombs, or burial sites that have not survived the pressures of time, urban expansion, and environmental change. Over millennia, subsequent settlement layers could have obscured or destroyed such sites entirely. Another consideration involves the political transition from Median rule to Achaemenid dominance in the 6th century BC. As power structures shifted, earlier Median centers may have been repurposed, rebuilt, or incorporated into the expanding imperial landscape. In such processes, earlier burial sites, if they existed, could have been unintentionally disrupted or intentionally repurposed, their original significance gradually fading from collective memory. However, there are also interpretive gaps that invite broader reflection. Ancient textual traditions often describe Median authority in semi-legendary terms, blending historical memory with later narrative reconstruction. Some scholars suggest that what is known as the Median kingdom may have been more decentralized in its earliest phase than later sources imply, with power distributed among regional elites rather than concentrated in a single dynastic center. In such a system, the absence of clearly identifiable royal tombs might reflect a different understanding of kingship itself, less centralized, less monumentally expressed. Other perspectives, more speculative in nature, consider whether significant burial sites may still exist but remain undiscovered beneath modern urban and rural landscapes. The geography of western Iran, with its long history of continuous habitation, presents a complex archaeological challenge. Ancient layers often lie deep beneath later construction, making excavation difficult or incomplete. It is not impossible that early Median royal burials remain hidden beneath sites that have yet to be fully explored. There are also broader interpretive questions about how early Iranian polities recorded and preserved their own history. Much of what is known about the Medes comes from external sources: Assyrian inscriptions, Greek historical accounts, and later Persian imperial narratives. If early Median rulers were not extensively memorialized in durable stone inscriptions or monumental architecture, their burial traditions may have been similarly understated or simply not preserved in ways that survive into the present archaeological record. Standing within this uncertainty, one question continues to emerge gently but persistently. Are the missing royal tombs of the early Median kings lost to destruction and erosion, or do they still rest beneath the landscapes of ancient Ecbatana and its surroundings, waiting for the moment when history is able to see them again? Continuing from the quiet uncertainty surrounding the early Median royal burials in the highlands of western Iran, the narrative now moves westward once more, toward the Anatolian plateau, where the ancient kingdom of Phrygia once rose and then seemed to fade almost as abruptly as it had appeared. In the central regions of modern-day Turkey, where rolling plains meet rocky uplands and river valleys carved through limestone ridges, lies the ancient heartland of Phrygia. This was a land remembered in legend as the realm of King Midas, the ruler associated in Greek tradition with the golden touch and immense wealth. Yet behind the mythic layers, Phrygia was a real Iron Age kingdom that flourished between the 9th and 7th centuries BC, controlling strategic trade routes across Anatolia and interacting with neighboring powers such as Assyria and Urartu. Archaeological remains from sites like Gordian reveal a sophisticated society with fortified structures, tumulus burial mounds, and complex material culture. The monumental burial mound believed to be associated with a Phrygian royal figure, often linked to the tradition of Midas himself, suggests a culture that invested heavily in elite funerary practices. Wooden chamber tombs, rich grave goods, and large-scale earthworks point to a kingdom that once had both stability and resources. And yet, despite this apparent strength, Phrygia experienced a rapid and dramatic collapse in the late 8th century BC. Ancient sources and archaeological evidence suggest a sudden disruption, often attributed to invasions by the Cimmerians, a nomadic force that moved through Anatolia during this period. Assyrian records describe widespread instability in the region, with cities destroyed or abandoned and political structures dismantled under external pressure. Mainstream historical interpretation sees this collapse as the result of combined factors: military invasion, internal fragmentation, and the broader volatility of Iron Age Anatolia. The Cimmerian incursions, in particular, are often cited as a key catalyst, weakening Phrygian power and contributing to the destruction of major centers such as Gordian. Over time, what remained of Phrygian identity was absorbed into successor states, including Lydian and later Persian-controlled territories. However, the speed and completeness of Phrygia's decline continue to raise subtle questions. Civilizations rarely vanish cleanly. Even in cases of military defeat, cultural continuity often persists in language, art, or administrative systems. Yet in Phrygia's case, the archaeological record suggests a striking break in material continuity at certain sites, as if key elements of its political and cultural structure were abruptly interrupted. This has led some researchers to consider whether the collapse may have been more complex than a single wave of destruction. While Cimmerian activity is well documented in the region, the extent and nature of their impact on Phrygian centers remains a subject of interpretation. Some propose a scenario in which external pressure coincided with internal political instability, possibly involving succession disputes or economic disruption along trade routes that had once sustained the kingdom's prosperity. There are also broader environmental and geographical considerations. Anatolia is a region shaped by seismic activity and shifting settlement patterns. Earthquakes, changes in river courses, or prolonged economic decline could have compounded political instability, making recovery difficult even after initial conflicts subsided. In such a scenario, collapse would not be a single event, but a gradual unraveling that appears sudden only in the archaeological record. Yet even these explanations do not fully resolve the sense of discontinuity. The symbolic world of Phrygia, reflected in its art, burial practices, and monumental architecture, seems to disappear from certain regions with unusual completeness. While later cultures inherit fragments of its legacy, the core political identity of the kingdom becomes increasingly difficult to trace with precision. This has led to more interpretive reflections about how ancient collapses are recorded. What appears as disappearance may in fact be transformation, with populations dispersing, merging, or adopting new identities under changing political conditions. The memory of Phrygia may have survived in altered forms, even as its original structures ceased to function as an independent kingdom. And so the question remains open, suspended in the quiet spaces between ruins and records. Did Phrygia truly collapse in a sudden historical rupture brought about by invasion and instability, or did it dissolve more gradually into the shifting fabric of Anatolia, leaving behind only echoes that we still struggle to fully interpret today? Continuing from the fading traces of Phrygia's sudden decline in Anatolia, the narrative shifts northward and eastward once again, toward the vast Eurasian steppe, an immense landscape where the boundaries between history, archaeology, and legend grow increasingly difficult to define. Across these grasslands, stretching from the Black Sea toward Central Asia, ancient writers describe the Scythians, mounted warriors who dominated the steppe world during the early 1st millennium BC. Their presence is recorded in Greek accounts, Assyrian inscriptions, and later Persian records, each portraying them as formidable horse archers, masters of mobility, and a force that few settled empires could easily contain. Yet within these descriptions lies a quieter, more complex question. Where did the Scythian warrior elite truly come from? Archaeologically, the Scythians are associated with a distinctive material culture that emerges suddenly across the steppe regions. Burial mounds known as kurgans contain richly furnished graves, often holding weapons, gold ornaments, and elaborate horse equipment. These sites reveal a society deeply organized around mobility, warfare, and status, with elite warriors buried alongside their horses, suggesting a symbolic and practical relationship between identity and the mounted lifestyle. The mainstream historical interpretation places the Scythian emergence within the broader development of nomadic cultures in the Eurasian steppe during the early Iron Age. Some scholars suggest that they evolved from earlier groups in the region, gradually forming a more unified cultural and military identity. Others emphasize the role of environmental adaptation. In a landscape where agriculture was limited, mastery of horseback riding and archery provided a decisive advantage, shaping a distinct warrior aristocracy over time. Yet despite these frameworks, the origins of the Scythian elite remain difficult to define with precision. There is no single identifiable starting point in the archaeological record that clearly explains how this highly organized martial class came into existence. Instead, what appears is a relatively rapid consolidation of practices, symbols, and burial traditions across a wide geographic area. Some interpretations suggest that the Scythian elite may have formed through the integration of multiple earlier steppe groups, each contributing elements of culture, technology, and social organization. In this view, the Scythians are not the product of a single origin, but of convergence, a gradual blending of nomadic traditions that eventually crystallized into a recognizable warrior identity. Herodotus provides one of the earliest narrative accounts, describing Scythian myths of origin that trace their ancestry to semi-divine figures emerging from the steppe landscape itself. While these stories are clearly mythological, they reflect an important cultural reality. The Scythians understood their identity in relation to the land, the horse, and the horizon, rather than fixed urban centers or written institutions. There are also archaeological anomalies that continue to invite cautious interpretation. Some of the earliest Scythian-style burial sites appear with fully developed artistic and martial traditions already in place, raising questions about how quickly such a complex cultural system could have formed. The sophistication of their gold craftsmanship, weapon design, and burial rituals suggests a long period of development that is not fully visible in the current record. In addition, the geographic spread of Scythian-related material culture, from the Pontic steppe to parts of Central Asia, suggests extensive interaction networks. Whether these reflect migration, cultural diffusion, or shared technological innovation remains an open question. The mobility of steppe societies makes it difficult to draw clear boundaries between origin and influence, especially in a landscape where movement itself was a defining feature of life. Some more speculative interpretations propose that the Scythian warrior elite may have drawn upon earlier, less documented nomadic traditions that have left minimal archaeological traces. In such a model, what we recognize as Scythian culture could represent the visible peak of a much longer, partially obscured evolutionary process across the steppe. And yet, even with these interpretations, a fundamental uncertainty remains. The Scythians appear in history already fully formed in many respects, organized, powerful, and culturally distinct, without a clearly traceable developmental sequence that explains their sudden prominence. So the question persists across the windswept grasslands where their kurgans still lie. Were the Scythian warrior elite the result of a gradual emergence from earlier steppe cultures? Or do they represent the visible surface of a deeper, still hidden history that has yet to be fully uncovered beneath the shifting sands of Eurasia? Continuing from the uncertain origins of the Scythian warrior elite, whose presence seems to emerge across the Eurasian steppe already fully formed, the narrative turns back toward the mountainous frontier, where earlier civilizations once rose and fell in close proximity, the region surrounding Lake Van. Set high in eastern Anatolia, Lake Van is the largest lake in the area, a vast body of deep blue water enclosed by volcanic peaks and rugged highlands. Its shores have witnessed thousands of years of human settlement, from prehistoric communities to the Iron Age kingdom of Urartu. The lake itself is both a source of life and a geological archive, slowly preserving and concealing traces of human activity beneath its shifting waters. It is along these submerged and surrounding landscapes that archaeologists and historians have long considered the possibility of vanished settlements. Communities that may once have existed on the lake's edges or in nearby valleys, now lost due to environmental change, seismic activity, or rising water levels over centuries. The historical foundation for this idea rests partly on what is known about Urartu and its network of fortified cities around Lake Van during the early 1st millennium BC. Archaeological surveys have identified numerous sites on elevated terrain, suggesting that settlement patterns were carefully adapted to both defensive needs and environmental conditions. Yet the lake's fluctuating levels over time raise an important question. How many earlier or lower-lying settlements might now lie beneath its waters? Mainstream geological and archaeological interpretations suggest that Lake Van has undergone long-term hydrological changes, influenced by volcanic activity, climate variation, and natural shifts in drainage systems. Over centuries, rising water levels could have gradually submerged shoreline settlements, particularly those constructed with perishable materials such as wood or mud brick. In such conditions, entire communities could disappear without leaving prominent surface traces. Underwater surveys and geological studies of the region have revealed submerged formations and sediment layers that indicate significant environmental transformation. However, definitive identification of large-scale urban settlements beneath Lake Van remains limited. The challenges of deep-water archaeology, combined with sediment accumulation and limited visibility, make exploration difficult and often incomplete. Despite these limitations, local traditions and historical interpretations have long spoken of ancient habitations along the lake's submerged edges. Some accounts, passed down through regional oral histories, suggest that structures once stood closer to the shoreline before being gradually engulfed by rising waters. While such narratives are not always directly supported by archaeological evidence, they reflect a persistent awareness of change within the landscape itself. More cautious scholarly perspectives suggest that rather than a single catastrophic submersion event, the disappearance of settlements around Lake Van may have occurred gradually over centuries, as populations shifted in response to political changes, such as the rise and fall of Urartian power and later regional kingdoms. Some communities may have been abandoned, leaving their structures to decay along the shoreline. Over time, natural processes could have further obscured or submerged these remains. There are also broader geological considerations. Lake Van sits within a tectonically active region shaped by volcanic formations and seismic activity. Earthquakes could have altered drainage patterns or caused localized subsidence, contributing to the gradual loss of habitable land around the lake's perimeter. In such a dynamic environment, the boundary between land and water would not have remained fixed for long periods. Some more interpretive hypotheses explore the possibility that certain submerged features may represent not fully submerged cities, but ritual or seasonal sites, locations used intermittently rather than continuously inhabited settlements. If so, their archaeological signature would be subtle, making identification even more complex beneath layers of sediment and water. Yet despite ongoing research, the lake continues to hold its silence. Each survey reveals fragments rather than complete narratives, isolated structures, geological anomalies, and traces of human presence that resist easy classification. The full extent of what lies beneath the water remains largely unknown, shaped by both natural concealment and the limits of current exploration technology. And so the question remains suspended beneath the surface of Lake Van itself. Are the traces found around its depths remnants of slowly abandoned shorelines? Or do they hint at entire settlements still lying submerged, waiting beneath layers of water and time for their stories to be fully understood? Continuing from the submerged uncertainty surrounding Lake Van, where entire landscapes seem to blur between land and water, the narrative now shifts further back into the written record itself, into the carved stone and clay of ancient Assyria, where history is preserved in fragments of imperial memory. In the great libraries and palaces of the Assyrian heartland, particularly in cities such as Nineveh and Assur, scribes recorded the expansion of one of the most powerful empires of the early 1st millennium BC. These inscriptions, etched into stone and written on clay tablets, detail military campaigns, tribute lists, and encounters with distant lands. Among these records are brief and often enigmatic references to foreign polities, names that appear only once, recorded in the context of conquest, diplomacy, or borderland conflict. It is within these fleeting mentions that a particular historical mystery emerges. The so-called forgotten kingdoms, known only from a single Assyrian inscription, never appearing again in surviving records from either Assyria or neighboring civilizations. These names often refer to regions beyond the established borders of the Assyrian Empire, mountain territories, steppe margins, or distant river valleys. In some cases, they are associated with military campaigns led by Assyrian kings seeking tribute or asserting dominance over peripheral regions. Yet after their brief appearance in these texts, these polities vanish entirely from the historical record, leaving no clear archaeological identification or continued textual presence. Mainstream historical interpretation suggests several possible explanations for this phenomenon. One is the nature of Assyrian record-keeping itself. Royal inscriptions were not comprehensive histories, but curated accounts of power, often emphasizing military achievement and territorial reach. A name recorded once may represent a minor polity, a temporary alliance, or even a localized tribal grouping that did not persist long enough to generate additional references in other sources. Another explanation lies in the fluid political geography of the ancient Near East. Many regions during this period were not organized into stable, centralized kingdoms in the modern sense. Instead, they consisted of shifting coalitions, tribal confederations, or city-states whose identities could change rapidly due to migration, warfare, or absorption by larger powers. A kingdom mentioned in one inscription may have existed only briefly as a recognizable political entity before being integrated into a neighboring structure or dissolving entirely. Yet despite these practical explanations, certain cases remain difficult to fully contextualize. Some of the named entities appear with specific geographic markers or descriptions that suggest more structured polities than simple tribal groups. In these instances, the absence of further references becomes more puzzling. If such kingdoms were significant enough to warrant Assyrian attention, why do they not reappear in later records, either as allies, tributaries, or conquered territories? This has led some historians to consider the possibility that Assyrian scribes occasionally recorded encounters with regions whose political identities were misunderstood, misrepresented, or translated imperfectly. Ancient toponyms and ethnonyms often shifted in meaning when passed between languages and administrative systems. A single recorded name may therefore represent an Assyrian interpretation of a much more complex or differently named local reality. There are also archaeological limitations to consider. Many regions referenced in Assyrian texts remain only partially excavated or have yet to yield inscriptions that could confirm their identity. In landscapes shaped by erosion, rebuilding, and continuous habitation, evidence of small or short-lived polities may be deeply buried or entirely erased. What survives in text may not yet be matched by material discovery. More interpretive perspectives suggest that these one-time kingdoms might reflect the edges of imperial perception itself. The Assyrian Empire, despite its administrative sophistication, viewed the world through the lens of expansion and control. Territories at the margins of its reach may have been recorded in simplified or symbolic terms, capturing momentary encounters rather than fully developed political systems. So the question continues to linger across the fragmented inscriptions of Assyria. How many forgotten kingdoms once existed on the edges of empire, recorded only once before disappearing into silence, and how many more remain unrecognized within the surviving fragments of ancient memory? Continuing from the fleeting references to forgotten kingdoms preserved only once in Assyrian inscriptions, the narrative now follows those same imperial records westward, toward the distant frontiers of the empire's reach, where the written word becomes thinner and certainty begins to dissolve. In the great Assyrian capitals of Nineveh, Kalhu, and Dur-Sharrukin, royal scribes documented the expansion of their kings with remarkable precision. Campaign after campaign was carved into stone walls and clay tablets, describing military marches across mountains, rivers, and foreign lands. Among these records are references to Western campaigns, expeditions that reached toward Anatolia, the Levant, and regions even further beyond direct imperial control. It is within these accounts that historians encounter a subtle but persistent gap. Mentions of journeys and conquests in the West that are not fully preserved in surviving archives. While some inscriptions describe victories in broad terms, others end abruptly or survive only in fragments. Entire sequences of administrative records, correspondence, or detailed campaign logs appear to be missing from the archaeological record. Mainstream historical interpretation suggests that this absence is largely the result of preservation bias. Assyrian records were often inscribed on clay tablets and stone reliefs, many of which were destroyed during the fall of Nineveh in 612 BC, when the Neo-Assyrian Empire collapsed under the combined pressure of internal instability and external forces. Fires that consumed palace archives likely destroyed vast quantities of written material, leaving only partial reconstructions of imperial activity. In addition, the Assyrian practice of selective documentation may have contributed to these gaps. Royal inscriptions were designed to emphasize success, dominance, and divine favor. Campaigns that were less decisive, politically sensitive, or strategically inconclusive may have been summarized briefly, or not recorded in detail at all. Western campaigns, conducted across complex political landscapes of small kingdoms, city-states, and shifting alliances, may not have always produced the clear outcomes favored in official narratives. Yet even within these explanations, certain inconsistencies remain. Some inscriptions refer to extended military activity in Western regions with unusual brevity, as if larger narratives once existed but are no longer present. References to tribute collection, city submissions, or border adjustments sometimes appear without corresponding detailed accounts of how these outcomes were achieved. This has led some scholars to consider the possibility that parts of the Assyrian archival system remain undiscovered. Archaeological excavations in Mesopotamia have uncovered only a fraction of ancient administrative centers. Many sites remain buried beneath modern settlements or unexcavated due to political and logistical constraints. It is possible that additional tablets, once part of larger archival collections, still lie beneath layers of earth, waiting to be recovered. Other interpretations focus on the nature of record transmission itself. Ancient archives were not static, they were curated, copied, and reorganized over time. Documents from Western campaigns may have existed in multiple versions, some of which were discarded or overwritten as political priorities shifted. What survives today may represent only the final layers of a much more complex documentary history. There are also interpretive frameworks that consider the symbolic nature of imperial record-keeping. In this view, Western campaigns may have been recorded not only as historical events, but as ideological statements about the reach of Assyrian power. The absence of detailed continuity in some accounts could reflect the prioritization of narrative impact over comprehensive documentation, where the goal was not to preserve every detail, but to project authority across space and time. And yet, despite these possibilities, the gaps remain tangible. The western frontier of Assyrian activity is known, but not fully seen. We can trace the outlines of campaigns, but not always their internal logic or complete progression. Between the fragments of stone and clay, there are pauses that suggest lost context, moments in which the full story once existed, but no longer survives in its entirety. So the question quietly persists within the surviving records of Assyria. How much of its Western history has been preserved, and how much has been irretrievably lost, not only to time but to the fragile pathways through which memory itself was once recorded, transmitted, and ultimately erased? Continuing from the fragmented traces of Assyria's Western campaigns, where entire historical sequences seem to vanish between surviving inscriptions, the narrative now shifts from imperial records to something even more complex: the origins of written tradition itself, and the question of who first shaped the earliest surviving portions of the Hebrew Bible. Across the landscapes of the southern Levant, where arid highlands meet river valleys and ancient trade routes once connected Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Arabia, the earliest textual traditions associated with the Hebrew Bible began to take form. These texts, preserved over centuries through careful copying and transmission, represent one of the most influential literary and religious corpora in human history. Yet their earliest layers remain difficult to trace with certainty. The surviving manuscripts we possess today are far removed from their initial composition. The oldest substantial textual witnesses, such as fragments from the Dead Sea Scrolls, dated to the last centuries BC, already reflect a developed and edited tradition. Beneath these later forms lies a deeper, more elusive question: when, and by whom, were the earliest portions of these texts first written? Mainstream scholarship generally situates the composition of the Hebrew Bible as a long and layered process. Rather than a single author or moment of creation, most scholars describe a gradual development spanning several centuries. Oral traditions, legal codes, historical narratives, and poetic material were likely transmitted across generations before being compiled and edited into written form. This process may have intensified during and after the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BC, when displaced communities sought to preserve identity through textual preservation. Archaeological discoveries provide partial context for this development. Inscriptions such as those found at Kuntalet Ajrud and Kerbet el-Qom suggest that literacy and writing were present in the region earlier than once assumed. These inscriptions, though limited in scope, indicate a complex religious and administrative landscape in which writing was used for both official and personal expression. Yet they do not directly reveal the authorship of larger narrative traditions. The question of authorship becomes even more complex when considering the internal structure of the earliest biblical texts. Scholars have long noted variations in style, vocabulary, and theological perspective across different sections. Some passages emphasize royal authority and centralized worship, while others reflect pastoral, tribal, or covenant-based frameworks. These differences have led to the development of source-critical models, which propose that multiple traditions were woven together over time. Among these models, various hypothetical sources have been proposed, often referred to in academic discourse as distinct textual strands. These are not identifiable individuals, but rather reconstructed literary layers inferred from linguistic and thematic analysis. Each layer may reflect different historical contexts, possibly originating from scribal circles in different regions or periods. Yet despite these analytical frameworks, the identity of the earliest writers remains unknown. If scribes were responsible for the initial recording of these traditions, they left no personal signatures. Ancient scribal culture often emphasized transmission over authorship, where texts were preserved as collective memory rather than individual expression. In such a system, the concept of a single author may not align with how these texts were originally understood. There are also interpretive perspectives that consider the possibility of royal or temple-based scribal schools, where educated elites compiled and recorded traditions as part of administrative and religious institutions. In this view, early biblical material may have emerged from environments where history, law, and theology were closely interconnected, shaped by the needs of governance and identity formation. Still, even these frameworks leave significant gaps. The transition from oral tradition to written narrative is not fully visible. We can observe the results of this process, but not its earliest stages with clarity. The voices behind the first written words remain unidentifiable, their identities absorbed into the texts they helped preserve. And so the question remains open, suspended within the very tradition it seeks to understand. Who first gave written form to the earliest portions of the Hebrew Bible? Individual scribes, collective schools, or evolving communities whose names have been lost within the layers of transmission that shaped one of the world's most enduring textual legacies? Continuing from the uncertain origins of the earliest written traditions in the southern Levant, where authorship dissolves into layers of scribal transmission, the narrative now shifts across the Mediterranean, toward the North African coast, where another ancient civilization presents a different kind of historical enigma, the unexplained wealth of early Carthage. On a curved stretch of shoreline facing the open sea, where modern Tunisia meets the Mediterranean, lies the site of ancient Carthage. Founded, according to tradition, in the late 9th century BC by settlers from Tyre, Carthage grew from a coastal colony into one of the most powerful maritime cities of the ancient world. Its harbors, ingeniously engineered in later periods, reflect a civilization deeply tied to trade, navigation, and economic expansion. Yet even in its earliest phases, Carthage appears in historical accounts with a striking characteristic: wealth. Classical writers describe a city rapidly accumulating resources, establishing trade networks that stretched across the Western Mediterranean, and developing a level of economic influence that seemed disproportionate to its early political footprint. Archaeological evidence confirms that Carthage engaged in extensive commerce, exchanging goods such as textiles, metals, ceramics, and agricultural products across North Africa, Iberia, and the islands of the Western Mediterranean. However, what remains less clearly understood is how this wealth accumulated so quickly in its formative centuries. The archaeological record of early Carthage, particularly its earliest settlement layers, is comparatively modest when contrasted with the later prosperity described in historical sources. This gap between early material evidence and later economic prominence has long drawn scholarly attention. Mainstream interpretations suggest that Carthage's wealth was the result of its strategic geographic position. Situated between eastern Mediterranean trade networks and the resource-rich western regions, the city was ideally placed to act as a commercial intermediary. Its settlers likely inherited maritime expertise from Phoenician traditions, allowing them to establish and expand trade routes efficiently. Over time, control of maritime corridors, access to agricultural hinterlands, and participation in regional exchange systems would have contributed to steady economic growth. Yet the speed and scale of this development still invite questions. Some historians note that Carthage appears in later historical narratives as already fully established in its economic systems, suggesting that earlier stages of accumulation are not well documented. This raises the possibility that much of its formative economic history occurred in contexts that left limited archaeological visibility, perhaps due to perishable trade goods, unrecorded transactions, or settlements that have not yet been fully excavated. There are also broader interpretive considerations regarding ancient trade economies. Wealth in the ancient Mediterranean was not solely tied to urban centers, but often embedded in networks of coastal stations, island outposts, and seasonal trading posts. Carthage may have inherited and expanded upon a pre-existing Phoenician commercial infrastructure that operated across multiple regions, much of which remains archaeologically fragmented. If so, its apparent rapid rise could reflect the consolidation of a much older distributed system, rather than sudden economic emergence. More speculative perspectives explore whether early Carthaginian wealth was also shaped by less visible forms of exchange, such as control over specialized knowledge of navigation, metallurgy, or agricultural production. While difficult to trace materially, such advantages could have played a role in strengthening its position within regional networks. However, these ideas remain interpretive, grounded more in economic modeling than direct archaeological evidence. The archaeological landscape of Carthage itself has been heavily shaped by later historical events, including destruction, rebuilding, and urban development in subsequent eras. These processes have obscured earlier layers of the city, making it difficult to reconstruct its initial stages in full detail. Excavations continue to reveal fragments of domestic life, trade activity, and early urban planning, but a complete picture of its earliest wealth accumulation remains elusive. And so the question lingers within the foundations of the ancient city. Was Carthage's early wealth the result of rapid economic expansion driven by geography and trade, or does it reflect a deeper, more gradual accumulation of resources across a wider and less visible network of exchange? One that has yet to be fully recovered from beneath the shifting layers of Mediterranean history. Continuing from the economic enigma of early Carthage, where prosperity seems to emerge faster than the archaeological record can fully explain, the narrative now turns back to the eastern Mediterranean, toward the highlands and ancient fortified cities of the Kingdom of Judah. Here, in the rugged hill country surrounding Jerusalem, archaeologists have uncovered layers of settlement stretching back into the Iron Age, revealing a society deeply shaped by administration, religion, and regional conflict. Stone fortifications, storage jars stamped with official seals, and inscriptions in early script all point to a structured kingdom that developed gradually over centuries between the 10th and 6th centuries BC. Within this historical framework lies a quieter and more elusive question: the fate of Judah's sacred objects, items described in ancient traditions as central to religious life, ritual identity, and royal legitimacy. Among these are references in historical and religious texts to sacred temple artifacts, ceremonial furnishings, and symbolic objects associated with worship practices centered in Jerusalem. These descriptions suggest that such objects held immense cultural and spiritual significance, carefully maintained within sacred spaces and closely tied to the authority of the temple establishment. However, the archaeological record presents a stark limitation. The Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem in 586 BC marks a decisive turning point in the history of the region. Historical accounts and archaeological evidence agree that the city was destroyed, its temple dismantled, and much of its elite population exiled. What remains uncertain is the precise fate of the sacred objects that were once housed within the temple complex. Mainstream historical interpretation suggests that many of these items were likely taken as spoils of war or destroyed during the conquest. Ancient Near Eastern warfare frequently involved the removal of religious artifacts as symbols of political and cultural dominance. In such a context, sacred objects would have been either transferred to the victor's treasuries or repurposed within new ideological frameworks. Yet the surviving records are incomplete. While some sources refer to items being taken, they do not provide detailed inventories or final accounts of their ultimate disposition. This absence leaves room for uncertainty about what was removed, what was destroyed, and what may have been lost in the chaos of destruction and displacement. Some interpretations suggest that not all sacred objects were necessarily centralized or permanently stored in a single location. The possibility exists that certain ritual items were distributed among different priestly groups or relocated during periods of instability prior to the final destruction. If so, fragments of these traditions and objects may have been dispersed, leaving little cohesive trace in the archaeological record. There are also more interpretive and symbolic perspectives that consider the role of memory and continuity. In this view, sacred objects may have been preserved not only as physical artifacts, but also as part of evolving ritual practice. Even if original items were lost, their significance could have been maintained through replacement objects, oral tradition, or reconstructed ritual systems in later communities. Archaeologically, the challenge is compounded by the nature of material preservation. Organic materials, textiles, and finely crafted ceremonial objects are less likely to survive destruction events and long-term exposure. Even metal objects, if melted down or repurposed, lose their original identity, leaving behind only indirect traces of their existence. The absence of definitive discoveries has led to a wide range of cautious hypotheses, but no universally accepted conclusion. Excavations in and around Jerusalem continue to reveal administrative seals, domestic artifacts, and architectural remains, yet the most symbolically significant items described in ancient texts remain unconfirmed in the archaeological record. And so the question remains suspended between history and tradition. What became of the sacred objects once housed within the kingdom of Judah's central sanctuary? Were they destroyed in the violence of conquest, carried away into foreign treasuries, or gradually transformed and absorbed into new forms of ritual memory that no longer preserve their original shape, but still echo their significance across time? Continuing from the uncertain fate of the sacred objects of the kingdom of Judah, where loss, destruction, and memory blur into a single unresolved narrative, the focus now shifts northeastward into the broader traditions of Mesopotamia, where history and legend often intertwine in unexpected ways. Among the figures that emerge from this ancient landscape, few are as enigmatic as Semiramis. Associated in later Greek, Assyrian, and Near Eastern traditions with extraordinary power, monumental building projects, and distant conquests, her name appears across a wide span of historical storytelling. Yet beneath the layers of legend lies a persistent question: who was Semiramis, and what, if any, historical figure stands at the origin of her identity? In the heart of ancient Assyria, where cities such as Nineveh, Kalhu, and Ashur once dominated the banks of the Tigris River, royal inscriptions and administrative records document a series of powerful queens and royal consorts who played significant roles in court politics and imperial governance. Assyrian royal women, particularly during the Neo-Assyrian period, could hold influence in diplomacy, religious patronage, and dynastic continuity. It is within this historical context that some scholars have attempted to trace the roots of the Semiramis tradition. One commonly discussed historical candidate is Shemuramat, a queen consort of Shamshi-Adad V in the 9th century BC, who later appears to have exercised influence as a regent for her son, Adad-Nirari III. Inscriptions from this period acknowledge her status in ways that are unusual for royal women of the time, suggesting a level of authority that extended beyond ceremonial roles. Her name, preserved in Assyrian records, is one of the few female figures of the period explicitly linked to governance. Over time, however, the historical Shemuramat appears to have been transformed through layers of cultural retelling. In Greek historical writing and later classical traditions, Semiramis emerges not merely as a queen, but as a semi-mythical ruler credited with founding cities, constructing vast architectural works, and leading military campaigns across distant lands. The scale of these attributed achievements far exceeds what is documented in Assyrian records, suggesting a process of narrative expansion across centuries. Mainstream historical interpretation generally views Semiramis as a composite figure, one whose identity was shaped by the blending of real historical memory and later mythological elaboration. In this framework, Semiramis may represent a historical foundation upon which later traditions built a far more elaborate and symbolic narrative. As stories traveled across cultures and languages, elements of different figures, events, and symbolic motifs may have merged into a single legendary persona. Yet certain aspects of the Semiramis tradition remain difficult to fully explain. The persistence of her name across diverse cultural sources, often associated with large-scale construction projects and boundary-crossing campaigns, suggests that she occupied a particularly powerful place in collective memory. Whether as a historical regent, a symbolic archetype of female rulership, or a fusion of multiple figures, her image consistently reflects themes of authority, transformation, and expansion. There are also interpretive perspectives that consider how ancient societies constructed memory itself. In such frameworks, Semiramis may represent not a single individual, but a narrative vessel through which later cultures expressed ideas about empire, legitimacy, and the limits of human achievement. Her association with monumental architecture, for example, may reflect the symbolic attribution of anonymous works to a memorable name, a common practice in ancient storytelling traditions. Archaeologically, however, there is no direct material evidence that fully corresponds to the legendary scale of Semiramis's attributed works. The monumental structures of Assyria and surrounding regions are well documented, but their construction is generally credited to multiple rulers and long-term state projects, rather than a single individual. This gap between narrative and material record continues to define the mystery, and so the question remains open, suspended between history and legend. Was Semiramis a powerful Assyrian queen whose memory expanded through centuries of storytelling, or does her figure represent something broader, an evolving reflection of how ancient civilizations understood power, memory, and the transformation of human identity across time? Continuing from the layered traditions surrounding Semiramis, where historical figures and cultural memory seem to merge into a single evolving narrative, the exploration now shifts eastward once more into the mountainous landscapes of western Iran, where one of the most visually striking archaeological discoveries of the Iron Age continues to raise quiet but persistent questions. In the rugged terrain of Luristan, carved by valleys and high ridges that separate ancient settlement zones, archaeologists have uncovered thousands of bronze artifacts dating primarily to the early 1st millennium BC. These objects, daggers, pins, horse trappings, finials, and intricately cast figurines, are distinguished by their extraordinary craftsmanship and recurring symbolic forms. Often discovered in burial contexts, they reflect a culture deeply engaged with metallurgy, ritual practice, and the symbolic language of objects. Unlike many ancient artifact groups that can be clearly associated with a known political entity, the Luristan bronzes remain difficult to attribute to a specific kingdom or centralized state. They are generally linked to nomadic or semi-nomadic groups inhabiting the Zagros Mountains. Yet the absence of written records from these communities leaves their social and political structure largely open to interpretation. Mainstream archaeological perspectives suggest that these objects were primarily funerary in nature. Many were found in graves, indicating they may have been placed alongside the dead as offerings, symbols of status or protective items intended for the afterlife. The repetition of certain motifs, animal figures, stylized human forms, and hybrid creatures, suggests a shared visual language, possibly connected to belief systems or mythological traditions that have not survived in textual form. Yet the sheer diversity and complexity of these artifacts have led to ongoing questions about their broader function. Some scholars propose that they may not have served a single purpose, but rather multiple roles within ritual, social, and practical contexts. Horse fittings, for example, may reflect the importance of mobility and pastoral life, while more elaborate ceremonial pieces could indicate status differentiation within small, mobile communities. What complicates interpretation further is the lack of clear settlement evidence directly associated with the production centers of these objects. While metallurgical analysis indicates advanced casting techniques and specialized craftsmanship, the workshops where these items were produced remain largely unidentified. This absence raises the possibility that production may have been dispersed across multiple small-scale communities rather than concentrated in a single urban center. There are also interpretive approaches that view the Luristan bronzes through a symbolic or ritual lens. In this perspective, the repeated motifs, particularly those involving animals such as goats, lions, and birds, may represent cosmological concepts, protective symbols, or expressions of identity tied to clan structures or spiritual beliefs. Without accompanying written explanations, however, these interpretations remain cautious and open-ended. Some more speculative theories suggest that the bronzes could represent the material remains of a broader cultural network that extended beyond the Zagros region, possibly connecting to neighboring civilizations through trade or shared artistic traditions. While stylistic comparisons have been drawn with objects from Mesopotamia and the Iranian plateau, definitive links remain difficult to establish with certainty. There is also the question of why so many of these artifacts appear in burial contexts. Were they personal possessions, ritual offerings, or standardized funerary equipment? The consistency of certain types alongside the variability of others suggests a complex system of meaning that is not yet fully understood. Each discovery adds detail, but not always clarity. And so the Luristan bronzes remain suspended between function and symbolism, between daily use and ritual significance. They are objects that speak with extraordinary visual clarity, yet remain silent in explanation. As archaeologists continue to uncover new examples across the Zagros region, one question continues to emerge beneath the surface of interpretation. Were these bronzes simply the material culture of fragmented mountain communities? Or do they represent the visible traces of a more complex belief system and social structure that has yet to be fully reconstructed from the silence of pre-literate history? Continuing from the enigmatic symbolism of the Luristan bronzes in the highlands of western Iran, where objects speak more clearly than the cultures that created them, the narrative now shifts back toward the Mediterranean world, to a period of profound disruption at the end of the Late Bronze Age. Along the coasts and islands of the eastern Mediterranean, from Anatolia to the Levant and down toward the Nile Delta, archaeological layers from around the 12th century BC reveal a pattern of widespread upheaval. Cities were destroyed or abandoned, trade networks collapsed, and long-established political systems entered a period of fragmentation. In ancient Egyptian inscriptions, this era is associated with references to groups known collectively as the Sea Peoples, a term used to describe various maritime raiding confederations whose origins remain uncertain. Among these references, certain inscriptions and reliefs, particularly those associated with the reign of Ramesses III, depict naval battles and land invasions, portraying these groups as formidable seaborne forces moving through the eastern Mediterranean. Some of the named groups within these records, such as the Peliset, Sheridan, and others, have been the subject of extensive scholarly discussion, though their exact identities and origins remain debated. What is less clearly understood, however, is what happened to those who survived these conflicts. Mainstream historical interpretation suggests that after their defeat or dispersal by Egyptian forces and other regional powers, elements of these maritime groups may have settled in various coastal regions of the eastern Mediterranean. Archaeological evidence in certain areas of the southern Levant, including changes in material culture during the early Iron Age, has been interpreted by some scholars as reflecting the arrival or integration of new populations during this transitional period. These shifts are visible in pottery styles, settlement patterns, and architectural changes, though their precise causes remain complex and multi-layered. Yet the archaeological record does not present a unified or fully coherent picture of these movements. Instead, it reveals regional variation, gradual cultural blending, and localized adaptation. This has led to ongoing discussion about whether the so-called Sea Peoples should be understood as a single migrating force, or as a broader, more diverse set of maritime groups, whose identities were shaped and reshaped through contact, conflict, and settlement. Within this broader uncertainty lies the quieter question of survival. If some of these groups were displaced from their original maritime networks, where did they go, and how were they absorbed into the societies they encountered? Some interpretations suggest gradual integration into existing coastal populations, where maritime skills and cultural practices may have been adopted and adapted over time. In this view, survival does not imply continuity as distinct groups, but transformation within new social and political contexts. Other perspectives, more speculative in nature, explore the possibility that certain maritime traditions attributed to these groups may have persisted in fragmented form across different regions. Shared technological features in shipbuilding, weaponry, or pottery styles have occasionally been examined for possible connections, though such similarities can also arise independently in seafaring cultures facing similar environmental conditions. There is also the challenge of interpretation from Egyptian sources themselves. Royal inscriptions often present events through a highly structured narrative lens, emphasizing victory and divine order. The portrayal of foreign groups may therefore reflect political framing as much as historical detail, complicating efforts to reconstruct precise movements or outcomes. Archaeology continues to refine this picture, revealing new settlement layers and material transitions that suggest a complex process of cultural change rather than a single, uniform event. Coastal sites show evidence of continuity alongside disruption, making it difficult to draw clear boundaries between disappearance and assimilation. And so the question of the Sea Peoples' survivors remains open within the fragmented landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean. Were they fully dispersed and absorbed into existing societies, or do traces of their maritime identities still persist, subtly woven into the cultural and technological transformations of the early Iron Age, waiting to be more clearly understood through the slowly accumulating evidence of time? Continuing from the uncertain fate of the Sea Peoples and their gradual absorption into the shifting cultures of the Eastern Mediterranean, the narrative now moves inland once again, toward the highlands and river valleys of southeastern Anatolia and northern Syria. Here, in the centuries following the collapse of the Hittite Empire around the 12th century BC, a new constellation of small kingdoms emerged, often referred to by historians as the Neo-Hittite states. These cities and polities, such as Carchemish, Zincirli, ancient Sam-al, and Tel Barsip, carried forward elements of Hittite cultural and political tradition while adapting to the fragmented post-imperial landscape. Stone reliefs carved into palace walls depict rulers, deities, and processions, while inscriptions in Luwian hieroglyphs and Assyrian cuneiform record alliances, conflicts, and tributary relationships. For a time, these cities formed a patchwork of fortified centers that balanced independence with the pressures of larger emerging powers. Yet by the 8th and 7th centuries BC, many of these Neo-Hittite cities appear to have undergone sudden or poorly documented abandonment. Archaeological layers in several sites reveal signs of disruption: burn layers, collapsed structures, and abrupt changes in material culture. In some cases, occupation seems to decline rapidly, replaced by sparse evidence of later reoccupation or long-term desertion. Mainstream historical interpretation attributes much of this transformation to the expansion of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Assyrian military campaigns into the region are well documented in royal inscriptions, describing the conquest of city-states, the deportation of populations, and the incorporation of territories into imperial administration. In this framework, the abandonment of Neo-Hittite cities is often understood as the result of military defeat, forced resettlement, and administrative restructuring under Assyrian control. However, the archaeological record does not always present a uniform pattern of destruction. While some sites show clear evidence of violent collapse, others display more gradual decline. In certain cities, monumental architecture appears to have fallen out of use without a single identifiable destruction layer, suggesting that political and economic changes may have played an equally significant role alongside military events. This uneven pattern has led researchers to consider additional factors. Economic shifts in trade routes across Anatolia and the Levant may have reduced the strategic importance of certain urban centers. As imperial networks expanded and reoriented under Assyrian influence, some cities may have been bypassed in favor of new administrative hubs, leading to population decline over time. Environmental factors, including changes in river courses or agricultural productivity, may also have contributed to the gradual weakening of urban stability. Yet even with these explanations, questions remain about the speed and completeness of abandonment at certain sites. Some Neo-Hittite cities show signs of well-developed urban planning and strong regional identity shortly before their decline, raising the possibility that their disappearance was not solely a matter of external conquest or economic decline, but a combination of multiple overlapping pressures. There are also interpretive considerations regarding cultural continuity. In some cases, elements of Neo-Hittite artistic and administrative traditions appear to persist in later Assyrian and regional contexts, suggesting that while cities may have been abandoned as political centers, aspects of their cultural identity were absorbed rather than entirely erased. Relief styles, iconography, and even certain linguistic features can be traced in modified forms across subsequent centuries. Still, the physical abandonment of these urban centers leaves a striking impression. Cities that once served as administrative and ceremonial hubs became quiet landscapes of stone ruins, their carved monuments exposed to time, erosion, and repurposing by later populations. The reasons for their decline are visible in fragments, but the full sequence of their transformation remains difficult to reconstruct with precision. And so the question continues to linger among the remnants of these once active cities. Were the Neo-Hittite urban centers primarily victims of sudden imperial conquest? Or do their abandoned streets and silent courtyards reflect a more gradual unraveling of political, economic, and environmental conditions that has yet to be fully understood in its total complexity? Continuing from the fading outlines of Neo-Hittite cities, where urban life slowly gave way to silence, leaving only fragments of carved stone and uncertain decline, the narrative now shifts far to the south and east, into one of the most arid and visually striking landscapes on Earth, the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula. From above, these vast basalt plains and sandy expanses reveal something unexpected. Across regions of northern Arabia, particularly in areas of Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and surrounding desert corridors, enormous stone structures and geometric formations stretch across the landscape. Known collectively as desert geoglyphs, these constructions include long stone kites, radial patterns, enclosures, and elongated walls that can extend for hundreds of meters or even kilometers. Unlike the fleeting traces of settlements or the fragmented ruins of cities, these geoglyphs are deliberate in scale and design. Some consist of low stone walls forming funnel-shaped structures, while others take on circular or abstract geometric forms that are only fully visible from aerial perspective. Their age is generally estimated to extend back to the Neolithic and early Bronze Age periods, with some potentially dating several thousand years BC, though precise dating remains challenging due to the nature of the materials and environmental conditions. Mainstream archaeological interpretation suggests that many of these structures served practical purposes related to hunting and animal management. The so-called desert kites, for example, are widely believed to have been used as large-scale hunting traps. Animals such as gazelles may have been guided by human activity and terrain features into enclosed areas where they could be more easily captured. This interpretation is supported by the shape and positioning of many structures, which appear strategically aligned with migratory routes and topographical features. Yet the sheer scale of these constructions raises additional questions. Some geoglyphs extend across terrain in ways that suggest coordinated effort far beyond small hunting groups. The labor required to construct kilometer-long stone lines in harsh desert conditions implies sustained organization, planning, and communication across large groups of people whose social structure remains largely unknown. This has led some researchers to consider broader social or ritual functions. Certain formations do not appear to be directly linked to practical hunting geography, suggesting that symbolic or ceremonial purposes may have also played a role. The geometric precision of some layouts, visible only from elevated perspectives, has prompted interpretations that these structures may have held meanings related to cosmology, territorial marking, or seasonal cycles. More speculative perspectives suggest that these geoglyphs could represent a form of landscape-scale communication or mapping system, encoding information about resources, movement routes, or group identities. While intriguing, such interpretations remain difficult to confirm due to the absence of written records or associated cultural artifacts that could directly explain their function. Environmental and geological factors also complicate interpretation. Over thousands of years, shifting sands and erosion have altered the visibility and integrity of many structures. Some geoglyphs may now appear more abstract or fragmented than they originally were, making reconstruction of their original form and purpose more challenging. In addition, the distribution of these formations across vast and sometimes disconnected regions suggests that multiple cultural groups may have participated in similar construction practices, either independently or through shared traditions. This raises the possibility that the geoglyph phenomenon represents not a single cultural system, but a broader pattern of human interaction with extreme desert environments. Despite decades of study and increasingly detailed satellite imagery, many of these structures remain only partially understood. Excavations can reveal construction techniques and localized usage patterns, but they rarely provide definitive explanations for the full range of forms observed across the Arabian deserts. And so the landscape remains marked by questions written in stone across the sand. Were these enormous geoglyphs primarily functional hunting structures, ritual expressions embedded in the desert itself, or part of a broader cultural system whose meaning has been gradually erased by time, leaving only their vast and silent outlines visible beneath the open sky? Continuing from the silent geometry of Arabia's desert geoglyphs, where meaning is carved into vast landscapes but resists certainty, the narrative now turns northwest across the Mediterranean toward the ancient hills and coastal plains of central Italy. Here, in what is now Tuscany and parts of northern Lazio, the civilization of the Etruscans once flourished between roughly the 8th and 3rd centuries BC. Their cities, Tarquinia, Veii, Cerveteri, and others, were marked by impressive architecture, complex burial practices, and a distinctive artistic tradition that deeply influenced early Rome. Tombs carved into rock, painted with vivid scenes of banquets, rituals, and symbolic imagery, offer a rare glimpse into their worldview. Yet despite the richness of their material culture, one of the most striking absences in Etruscan history is the near-total disappearance of sustained written historical records. The Etruscans did possess a writing system, derived in part from early Greek influences, and inscriptions have been found on tombs, pottery, mirrors, and votive objects. These inscriptions confirm that literacy existed and was used for personal names, dedications, and short texts. However, what is largely missing are extended historical narratives, chronicles, royal annals, or literary works that might have recorded the internal history of their cities and political systems in detail. Mainstream historical interpretation suggests several reasons for this absence. One of the most significant is the medium of writing itself. Much of what the Etruscans may have written could have been recorded on perishable materials such as wood, wax tablets, or textiles, which do not survive well in archaeological conditions. Unlike stone inscriptions, these materials are highly vulnerable to decay, fire, and reuse. Another important factor is cultural transmission. After the gradual incorporation of Etruscan cities into the expanding Roman sphere, particularly from the 4th to 1st centuries BC, Latin language and Roman administrative systems became dominant. Over time, Etruscan language and writing fell out of everyday use, leading to a natural decline in the copying and preservation of Etruscan texts. Without continued transmission, written works that were not preserved in durable formats may have been lost permanently. Yet even with these explanations, the contrast remains striking. Neighboring civilizations in the Mediterranean, such as the Greeks and later the Romans, produced extensive historical and literary traditions that survived through copying and reinterpretation. The Etruscans, despite their evident sophistication, leave behind only fragments of their written voice. This has led some researchers to consider whether Etruscan written culture was more limited in scope than once assumed. Perhaps writing was primarily administrative or ritualistic rather than historiographical, used for specific functions rather than for recording continuous narratives of political events. In this view, the absence of historical texts is not necessarily a loss, but a reflection of how writing was culturally employed. However, this interpretation does not fully resolve the broader question of what may have once existed. References in later Roman sources occasionally suggest that Etruscan religious and scholarly traditions were extensive, including systems of divination, ritual knowledge, and possibly written codices that have not survived. Whether these accounts reflect historical reality or Roman interpretation of Etruscan culture remains uncertain. There are also archaeological limitations to consider. Many Etruscan sites have been heavily influenced by later Roman construction, modern development, and long periods of reuse. It is possible that written materials once stored in temples, archives, or elite households were destroyed or repurposed in ways that left no trace. Each excavation reveals new objects, but rarely anything that resembles continuous narrative documentation. And so the silence of early Etruscan written history remains one of the quieter mysteries of the ancient Mediterranean. We see the art, the architecture, and the echoes of a sophisticated society, but the longer written voice that might have explained its internal world is largely absent. This absence leaves an open question resting among the painted tombs and stone cities of ancient Etruria. Were the Etruscans primarily a culture that recorded its identity in symbolic and ritual forms rather than written history, or did a richer literary tradition once exist, now lost so completely that only its absence continues to speak across time? Continuing from the silent gaps left behind by the Etruscans, where an entire written tradition seems to have faded into fragments and absence, the narrative now moves once again across the Mediterranean, eastward into the rugged interior of Anatolia. Here, in modern-day Turkey, mountains rise in layered ridges above fertile valleys that once formed the crossroads of ancient civilizations. This region, Anatolia, was home to a remarkable diversity of cultures during the Bronze and Iron Ages. Hittites, Luwians, Phrygians, Urartians, and many smaller regional groups whose identities often overlapped and shifted over time. Across this landscape, Archaeologists have uncovered thousands of inscriptions carved into stone, stamped onto seals, or etched onto monuments. These texts are written in a variety of ancient languages and scripts: Hittite cuneiform, Luwian hieroglyphs, Phoenician alphabets, and later regional adaptations. Many of these inscriptions have been successfully translated, revealing political treaties, royal proclamations, religious dedications, and administrative records. Yet alongside these deciphered texts, there remain others that resist full understanding. Inscriptions that can be read in part but not fully interpreted, or that belong to linguistic systems still not entirely reconstructed. These untranslated or partially translated inscriptions form one of the quieter but persistent mysteries of ancient Anatolia. Mainstream scholarship generally attributes this difficulty to several overlapping factors. One is linguistic complexity. Ancient Anatolia was not a linguistically uniform region. It was a mosaic of Indo-European, Anatolian, and non-Indo-European languages, many of which evolved over time or existed in localized forms. Some scripts represent transitional stages of writing systems, where symbols carry meanings that shift depending on context, making full translation challenging. Another factor is the fragmentary nature of the surviving material. Many inscriptions are damaged, eroded, or incomplete, preserved only in partial sections of stone or broken artifacts. In such cases, even when individual signs can be identified, the absence of surrounding context makes full interpretation uncertain. Without complete sentences or parallel texts, meaning can remain speculative. There is also the issue of undeciphered or poorly understood scripts. While major writing systems like Hittite cuneiform have been largely deciphered, others, particularly local variants of hieroglyphic or alphabetic systems, remain only partially understood. In some cases, inscriptions appear to combine multiple scripts or languages, suggesting multilingual environments where official and local forms of communication overlapped. Yet even within these explanations, certain inscriptions continue to challenge interpretation. Some texts appear formulaic, repeating patterns that suggest ritual or ceremonial usage, but without clear linguistic parallels in known languages. Others contain sequences of signs that do not match established grammatical structures, raising questions about whether they represent language, symbolic notation, or something closer to coded expression. This has led some researchers to consider whether certain inscriptions may reflect forms of writing that were never intended for broad communication. They may have functioned as specialized ritual scripts used by limited groups of scribes or religious practitioners, where meaning was transmitted orally alongside written symbols. In such systems, the written text alone would not be sufficient for full interpretation. There are also interpretive approaches that explore the possibility of regional dialects or extinct linguistic branches that have left no surviving descendants. If such languages once existed in Anatolia, their written records could appear partially recognizable yet ultimately untranslatable, occupying a space between known linguistic systems and lost forms of expression. Archaeological discovery continues to add new material each year, but interpretation often lags behind. Each newly uncovered inscription brings the possibility of clarification, yet also the reminder that ancient Anatolia was a place of immense cultural diversity, where writing systems evolved, overlapped, and sometimes disappeared without leaving complete explanatory frameworks behind. And so the inscriptions remain carved into stone across Anatolia's mountains and valleys, partially legible, partially silent, suspended between meaning and obscurity. The question that emerges from this landscape is not only what these inscriptions say, but whether some of them were ever fully understood in their own time, or whether they already carried meanings that even their original readers could interpret only within contexts now entirely lost to history. Continuing from the quiet trail of unresolved artifacts and fragmented histories, we move now from the shadows of those earlier enigmas into a discovery that, even today, resists full interpretation: an object so small in scale, yet so dense in meaning, that it has unsettled archaeologists for decades. Somewhere in the southwestern reaches of ancient Elam, in what is now modern-day southwestern Iran, lies the site of Arjan, an area that, for most of history, remained unremarkable to the outside world. That changed in 1982 when construction work unexpectedly broke into a sealed burial chamber. What was uncovered was not a simple grave, but a carefully preserved elite tomb filled with bronze vessels, golden ornaments, and ceremonial objects that seemed to belong to a world both familiar and distant at once. Among these items was a gold ring, small enough to rest quietly in the palm of a hand, yet crafted with a precision that immediately drew attention. It was not merely decorative. It appeared intentional in a way that suggested function, symbolism, and authority all at once. And like many objects recovered from Arjan, it carried something more unsettling than its material value. It carried uncertainty. The ring, often referred to by researchers as part of the broader Arjan treasure assemblage, was discovered alongside other elite artifacts, including the famous bronze bowl and finely worked gold objects. But unlike the more visually interpretable pieces, the ring resisted immediate classification. Its surface bore engraved symbols, markings that did not clearly match any fully understood writing system from the region's known Elamite inscriptions. At first glance, one might assume these markings were decorative motifs, perhaps abstract representations of power or religious imagery. Yet closer examination revealed deliberate repetition and structure. The symbols were not random. They followed a pattern, a sequence, something that suggested language, or something resembling it. And so a question quietly emerged among scholars. If this is writing, what exactly is it saying? To understand why this ring matters, one must first consider the world that produced it. Elam, an ancient civilization that flourished alongside early Mesopotamian cultures, was neither isolated nor fully understood in modern scholarship. Its people engaged in trade, warfare, and diplomacy with surrounding kingdoms. Yet their written language remains only partially deciphered. Many inscriptions survive, but large portions remain unreadable, like messages from a civilization still speaking through a broken transmitter. The Arjan ring sits precisely within that gap between knowledge and silence. Some researchers interpret the engravings as a form of administrative or ownership seal. In ancient societies, rings were often used as signets, pressed into clay to authenticate documents or mark authority. If this interpretation is correct, then the symbols might represent the identity of a high-ranking individual buried within the tomb, possibly a ruler or noble connected to the Elamite court. But there is a complication. The symbols on the ring do not perfectly align with known Elamite seal conventions. Certain strokes appear stylized beyond practical administrative use. The arrangement feels ceremonial, almost ritualistic. This has led some to suggest that the ring was not simply a tool of governance, but an object of religious or symbolic significance. And here, the mystery deepens. What if the ring was not meant to be read in the conventional sense at all? What if its symbols were not language in the modern understanding, but coded expressions of belief, cosmological markers meant to communicate with forces beyond the human world? In ancient Near Eastern cultures, the boundary between writing and ritual was often blurred. Symbols could function simultaneously as text, prayer, and protection. A single mark might invoke a deity, record a lineage, and serve as a magical safeguard. Within this framework, the Arjan ring could be interpreted not as a document, but as an object designed to mediate between the physical and the spiritual. Yet even this explanation does not fully settle the matter. Some scholars have pointed out subtle inconsistencies in the engraving technique. Certain symbols appear deeply cut, while others are faint, as if added at different times. This has led to the suggestion that the ring may have been reworked or repurposed, possibly over generations. If true, it would imply that the object carried significance long after its original creation, its meaning evolving, accumulating layers of interpretation as it passed through time. And then there is the question of context. The tomb in which the ring was found belonged to an individual of considerable wealth and status. The presence of imported materials and high craftsmanship suggests strong connections to elite networks, but no clear identification of the buried individual has ever been confirmed. No inscription explicitly names them. No definitive title survives. The identity of the tomb's occupant remains, like the ring itself, partially concealed. This absence of certainty has opened the door to broader speculation. One line of thought proposes that the symbols on the ring may represent an early or transitional script, an experimental writing system that never fully developed or was eventually replaced. In this view, the Arjan ring becomes a rare fragment of linguistic evolution, a glimpse into a moment when writing itself was still being negotiated and refined. Another interpretation, more cautious but equally intriguing, suggests that the ring's symbols could be a localized or personal cipher. In this scenario, the engravings would not be part of a standardized language at all, but a private system known only to a small group, perhaps a royal household, a priesthood, or an artisan guild. If so, then the meaning of the ring may have been intentionally restricted, designed to exclude rather than communicate broadly. And yet, there is something even more elusive that continues to draw attention. Certain researchers have noted that some of the symbols bear faint resemblance to motifs found in distant regions, suggesting possible cultural exchange far beyond what was previously assumed for the period. Could this ring hint at contact between otherwise unconnected traditions? Or is it simply a coincidence, a case of the human mind finding patterns where none were intended? The problem is that none of these interpretations can be definitively proven. Modern analytical techniques, microscopic imaging, material composition studies, and comparative epigraphy have all provided valuable insights into the ring's construction. We know it was crafted from high-purity gold. We know it was made with advanced metallurgical skill. We know it belonged to a highly developed cultural context. But knowing how it was made is not the same as knowing what it means. And that gap between craftsmanship and comprehension is where the mystery persists. Perhaps what makes the Arjan gold ring so compelling is not what it reveals, but what it refuses to reveal. It sits at the intersection of language and silence, of history and uncertainty. It is an object that suggests communication, yet withholds translation. A message that exists without a confirmed reader. One might imagine the moment it was created. Gold shaped under careful hands, symbols engraved with intention, perhaps under ritual instruction or royal command. Was it meant to be seen by many, or only by one? Was it a declaration of power, a prayer for protection, or something more personal? An identity encoded in metal, meant to survive long after spoken names were forgotten? Or perhaps it was never meant to be understood in the way we attempt to understand it today. There is also the possibility that the ring's meaning was never fixed, that its significance shifted depending on who held it, who viewed it, and who inherited it. In that sense, the mystery is not just about decoding symbols, but about recognizing that meaning itself may have been fluid in the ancient world, less like a locked message, and more like a living relationship between object and observer. Even now, thousands of years later, the Arjan ring remains silent. It does not confirm theories. It does not correct interpretations. It simply exists, bearing its inscriptions like a memory that refuses to fully surface. And so we are left with the same quiet uncertainty that has followed us through so many of history's unresolved artifacts. If this ring was meant to be read, then who was its intended reader? And if it was never meant to be read at all, then what exactly was it meant to preserve? Continuing from the silent enigma of engraved gold and unreadable symbols, We move now from the intimacy of a handheld object to something vastly larger, something carved not for the palm, but for the scale of a human encounter with stone, space, and silence itself. Far to the northwest of the Arjan region, across mountain corridors and ancient trade routes, lies a site that once stood as a threshold between the human and the divine. Nestled in the hills of what is now northern Syria, the ruins of Dara emerge from the landscape like fragments of a forgotten dialogue between stone and sky. Today, much of it lies in ruin, but in its preserved remnants, there remains a presence that is difficult to dismiss, a sense that the site was designed not merely to be seen, but to be experienced in a deeply intentional way. At the heart of this ancient complex once stood a temple, attributed by archaeologists to the Iron Age cultures of the region, often associated with the broader Neo-Hittite traditions of the early 1st millennium BC. Built from massive basalt blocks, the structure was not hidden or defensive in nature. Instead, it was open, deliberate, and ceremonial. Its architecture suggested a place where movement, ritual, and perception were all carefully orchestrated. And as one approaches its reconstructed memory today, even in fragments, the sense of scale alone raises questions that remain unanswered. What draws immediate attention, what continues to puzzle researchers, is not just the temple's layout, but what was embedded within it. At the entrance to the structure, carved directly into stone, are colossal footprints. Not small impressions, not decorative motifs, but full human-like footprints, each measuring far beyond normal proportions. One set leads inward, as though an enormous being had stepped into the temple itself. Another set exits, aligned with the architectural axis of the building. These are not random carvings. They are precise, intentional, and placed with spatial awareness that suggests symbolic meaning. And so a quiet question arises. Who was meant to walk here? In conventional archaeological interpretation, these footprints are often understood as ritual symbolism. They are frequently associated with the presence of a deity, most commonly the storm god known across the Levantine and Anatolian world, often referred to as Hadad or similar regional variations. In this reading, the footprints do not represent a literal giant, but the imagined arrival of divine presence into sacred space. The temple, then, becomes not just a building, but a staged encounter between human worshippers and an unseen God whose presence is marked only by what he leaves behind. Yet even within this interpretation, something remains unresolved. The scale of the footprints is not metaphorical in appearance. They are physically imposing, carved with dimensions that exceed ordinary human proportions by a significant margin. And while symbolic exaggeration is not uncommon in ancient religious art, the precision of these carvings has led some scholars to question whether symbolism alone is sufficient to explain them. Was the intention purely theological? Or does the carving preserve a memory of something more literal, an encounter, a tradition, or an oral history transformed into stone? The temple itself reinforces this ambiguity. Its entrance is structured as a progression through increasingly elevated spaces. One moves from outer courtyards into increasingly restricted chambers, as though passing through layers of perception or initiation. Along the walls, reliefs and bas-reliefs depict ceremonial scenes, protective figures, and stylized forms that suggest both human and supernatural presence intertwined. The architecture does not simply house ritual, it guides it. Light enters the structure in controlled ways, filtering through carefully positioned openings. Shadows stretch across basalt floors in patterns that shift throughout the day. Some researchers have suggested that this manipulation of light may have played a role in ritual practice, possibly creating moments where the temple's interior would appear transformed, as though animated by presence rather than stone. And yet, for all its architectural sophistication, the most enduring mystery remains those footprints. Alternative interpretations have emerged over time, especially among those who view ancient monuments through comparative mythology. Some propose that the footprints reflect a broader tradition of divine visitation narratives found across multiple ancient cultures, where gods are described not only as speaking or appearing, but physically walking among humans. In this context, the Dara footprints become part of a shared symbolic language rather than an isolated anomaly. Others have taken a more speculative stance, suggesting that the scale and placement of the carvings may preserve distorted memories of actual individuals, perhaps rulers elevated to divine status, or ceremonial figures whose presence was intentionally magnified through artistic exaggeration. In such a reading, the footprints would not belong to gods, but to humans transformed by belief into something larger than life. There are even more unconventional theories that circulate at the edges of archaeological discourse. Some suggest that the footprints encode astronomical or calendrical information, mapping cycles of time rather than physical presence. Others propose that they may have functioned as initiation markers, guiding participants through ritual stages that mirrored a symbolic journey into the divine realm. In these interpretations, the giant is not a being, but a metaphor for transformation itself. Yet none of these explanations fully dissolve the sense of unease that the site evokes when experienced directly or studied closely. There is a scale mismatch that persists between human understanding and architectural intention. The temple does not feel like a space designed solely for human proportion, even though it is undeniably human-made. It feels, in some subtle way, calibrated to something larger than everyday existence. This tension becomes even more striking when considering the broader cultural landscape of the period. The Iron Age societies of the region were deeply interconnected through trade, conflict, and shared religious motifs. Storm gods, fertility deities, and protective spirits appear across multiple sites, often with overlapping characteristics but differing local expressions. The Dara temple fits within this pattern, yet also stands apart due to its unusually pronounced emphasis on spatial symbolism and monumental footprint imagery. And then there is the question of time. The temple underwent multiple phases of construction and modification over centuries. Each layer added complexity, suggesting that its meaning was not fixed, but evolving. What began as a sanctuary may have become something more elaborate over generations, a place where memory, tradition, and political authority converged into architecture. If so, then the footprints may have been reinterpreted over time, their meaning shifting alongside the society that preserved them. In modern times, the site has faced significant damage due to conflict in the region. Reports indicate that much of the temple structure was severely impacted during recent decades, reducing large portions of the carved reliefs and architectural features to fragments. What remains is now studied through documentation, photographs, and partial reconstruction efforts. The physical presence of the temple has been diminished, but its questions have not. This loss introduces another layer to the mystery. When physical evidence is partially erased, interpretation becomes even more reliant on memory, record, and inference. And in that space between what was and what remains, imagination inevitably begins to fill the gaps. What did the temple feel like when it was complete? How did light move across those stone footprints when rituals were performed within its walls? Did worshippers see them as divine traces, literal impressions of a god's arrival? Or did they understand them as something more abstract, a visual language meant to reshape human perception of space and presence? Even the act of entering the temple may have carried meaning beyond what is easily reconstructed today. Walking along the same axis as those footprints, moving deeper into the structure, one might have felt the sensation of following rather than leading, of stepping into a narrative already in motion. Whether that narrative was mythological, political, or experiential remains unclear. And so the temple continues to resist closure. It stands as both structure and question, architecture and uncertainty. The basalt stones remain silent, yet their arrangement suggests intention. The footprints remain fixed, yet their meaning shifts depending on who studies them and from what perspective. Like the gold ring found far to the south in Arjan, this is an object, or in this case, a place, that communicates without fully translating itself into modern understanding. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect is not what we cannot explain, but how many layers of explanation seem possible without any one of them fully resolving the mystery. Symbol, memory, ritual, metaphor, history, all coexist without contradiction, yet none alone feel sufficient. And so we are left again in a familiar position, standing at the threshold of interpretation. If these footprints were meant to mark the passage of a god, then what kind of presence were ancient builders attempting to make visible in stone? Moving from the carved silence of basalt temples and the suggestion of divine footprints left in stone, we now descend into something less tangible but far more expansive, something that does not occupy space in the same physical way, yet once shaped the decisions of kings, the timing of wars, and the fears of entire civilizations. Because for the ancient Assyrians, the sky was never empty. It was a dense, layered manuscript, one that never stopped writing. High above the cities of Mesopotamia, beyond the walls of Nineveh, the night sky was observed not as a distant void, but as a living system of signs. Stars were not simply points of light. They were voices, movements, warnings, and sometimes promises. Every shift in the heavens carried meaning, and every meaning demanded interpretation. From the perspective of modern astronomy, these patterns are predictable. Lunar cycles repeat. Planets follow calculated paths. Eclipses can be forecast with precision. But in the world of the Assyrian Empire, predictability did not diminish fear. It intensified interpretation. If the heavens were orderly, then their messages must be deliberate. And if deliberate, then they must be read. This belief gave rise to one of the most extensive systems of celestial interpretation in the ancient world. A vast body of recorded omens, etched into clay tablets by generations of scribes who believed they were documenting not just astronomy, but communication from the divine. Many of these records were preserved in the royal archives of Nineveh, within what would later be identified as the Library of Ashurbanipal, a monumental collection of knowledge assembled under the reign of Ashurbanipal. Among administrative records, literary works, and mythological texts, there exists a dense and intricate corpus devoted entirely to celestial phenomena. These texts are often grouped under a larger interpretive tradition known today as Enuma Anu Enlil, a structured compilation of astronomical omens that attempts to correlate specific celestial events with outcomes on Earth. A lunar eclipse, for example, might not simply be recorded as an astronomical alignment. It could be interpreted as an omen of political instability, military defeat, or the death of a ruler. The rising of a particular planet in a specific constellation might signal prosperity or disaster. Even the color of the moon during an eclipse carried interpretive weight. But what makes these records so compelling is not just their content, it is their tone. They do not read like myth in the traditional sense, nor do they read like science. Instead, they occupy a liminal space between observation and anxiety, between careful measurement and existential interpretation. Each entry is precise, yet charged with implication. Each statement seems to carry the quiet tension of something both observed and feared. A typical omen might read, in essence, if the moon is eclipsed on such and such a night, then the land will experience upheaval. If Jupiter appears in a certain position, then the king's health will decline. The structure is consistent. The logic is repetitive, and yet the implications are anything but stable. One begins to notice something unusual in the sheer accumulation of these records. Thousands upon thousands of entries, layered over centuries, as if the sky itself was never allowed to speak just once, but repeatedly, insistently, in variations of the same language. And so a question emerges naturally. Were the Assyrians simply mapping coincidence, or were they constructing a framework that gave meaning to randomness? To modern readers, the system may appear as early proto-science mixed with religious interpretation. Yet, within its historical context, it functioned as a practical decision-making tool. Kings consulted astrologer priests before military campaigns. Rituals were performed to avert predicted misfortune. Entire political decisions could hinge on the reading of a celestial event. The sky was not symbolic, it was operational. And yet, despite its apparent structure, the system was never truly closed. Interpretation always remained necessary. Even identical celestial events could be read differently depending on context, timing, or accompanying signs. This introduced a persistent uncertainty into the heart of what was supposed to be a predictive system. If the heavens were speaking clearly, why did their meaning require constant reinterpretation? Part of the answer may lie in the nature of ancient observation itself. Without modern instruments, celestial events were tracked with remarkable care, but limited precision. Scribal schools trained specialists to recognize patterns, record anomalies, and compare events with historical archives. Over time, this produced an enormous dataset of interpreted sky phenomena, an archive of meaning layered upon observation. But meaning, unlike measurement, is unstable. Consider the lunar eclipse. To a modern astronomer, it is a predictable alignment of celestial bodies. To an Assyrian scholar, it was a moment of heightened significance, especially when occurring in specific regions of the sky or during certain political periods. The same event could be benign in one context and catastrophic in another. This flexibility of interpretation is what gave the system both its power and its ambiguity. Some scholars suggest that these omens may have functioned less as predictions and more as frameworks for managing uncertainty. In a world where political instability, war, and natural disasters were constant realities, the ability to assign meaning to celestial events may have provided psychological structure. The sky became a mirror for earthly concerns, a vast canvas onto which human anxiety could be projected and organized. Yet even this interpretation does not fully resolve the deeper mystery. Because among the thousands of recorded omens, there are patterns that resist simple categorization. Some entries appear inconsistent or symbolic in ways that do not align neatly with observable astronomy. Others suggest correlations that seem statistically arbitrary, yet are recorded with the same seriousness as more consistent observations. Why preserve such variability in a system that depended on authority and precision? One possibility is that the omen corpus was not intended to be purely predictive in a strict sense. Instead, it may have functioned as a living tradition, one that evolved over time, absorbing new interpretations, regional variations, and possibly even competing schools of thought. If so, then the texts are not a single unified system, but a layered conversation across generations. Another possibility opens a more speculative path, that some of these records preserve remnants of observational traditions that predate formal Assyrian astronomy. In this view, the omen texts could be accumulations of older Mesopotamian practices, reinterpreted and recontextualized over centuries. What appears inconsistent may actually be the fossilized overlap of multiple interpretive systems. There is also the question of transmission. The scribes who compiled these tablets were not passive recorders. They were trained interpreters, operating within institutions that valued both tradition and adaptation. A single omen could be copied, rephrased, expanded, or contextualized differently depending on the scribe or the political moment. Over time, this process may have introduced subtle shifts in meaning, gradually transforming observational records into a dense symbolic language. And yet, even with all these explanations, something remains unresolved. Why did the sky, of all possible systems, become the primary language of divine communication? Across cultures, the heavens have often been associated with order, permanence, and transcendence. But in the Assyrian context, this relationship becomes unusually structured, almost bureaucratic. The sky is not only divine, it is administrative. It keeps records. It issues warnings. It communicates through patterns that must be decoded by specialists. In this sense, the cosmos becomes not just a backdrop, but an active participant in governance. Imagine standing in Nineveh on a clear night. The city quiets. The air cools. Above, the stars shift slowly across the sky. Somewhere within the palace archives, scribes compare current observations with centuries of recorded omens. A planetary alignment appears. Tablets are consulted. Historical parallels are searched. Interpretations begin to form. At that moment, does the sky feel like a system of physics, or something closer to a language? And if it is a language, then who, or what, is speaking it? Modern archaeology has recovered only a fraction of the original omen corpus. Many tablets remain fragmented. Others are incomplete. Some are damaged beyond full reconstruction. And yet, even in their partial form, they reveal a civilization deeply committed to the idea that the universe is readable. But reading implies understanding, and understanding implies closure. The Assyrian omen tradition never fully provides that closure. Instead, it leaves us with a structure that is both ordered and open-ended, a system that insists on meaning, but never allows meaning to fully stabilize. Each interpretation leads to another question. Each celestial event opens another layer of uncertainty. Perhaps this is why these texts continue to resonate. Not because they predict the future, but because they reveal something enduring about the human desire to find coherence in the vastness above. The impulse to turn light into language, movement into message, pattern into purpose. And so the tablets remain, silent yet suggestive, resting in museum collections and archaeological archives, waiting to be read again and again through new frameworks of understanding. Moving from the celestial uncertainty of Assyrian omen tablets, where meaning itself seemed to drift like starlight across clay, we now turn our attention back to the earth. Yet here, too, certainty does not settle easily. Instead, it rises in stone, in sand, and in the silent geometry of ancient structures that still resist complete explanation. Far to the south of the familiar Nile Valley traditions associated with early dynastic kings, beyond the well-mapped heartlands of ancient Egypt, lies a landscape where history begins to blur at the edges. Along the middle stretches of the Nile, in what is now northern Sudan, the desert opens into a quieter register of antiquity. Here, among rocky plateaus and riverine corridors, stand the remains of some of the earliest pyramid-building traditions on the African continent. These are the necropolises of the ancient kingdom of Nubia, a region that developed in parallel with, and sometimes in tension with, the cultures of ancient Egypt. And among its most striking remnants are the early pyramid complexes of El Kuru and Nuri, where rows of steep, narrow pyramids rise from the sand like frozen geometric thoughts. Unlike the massive, broad-based pyramids of Giza, these structures are smaller, sharper in angle, and clustered tightly together. They were built primarily during the Kingdom of Kush, particularly in the Napatan and Meroitic periods, beginning around the 8th century BC and continuing for centuries afterward. Their forms echo Egyptian architectural influence, yet they also diverge in ways that suggest local innovation, adaptation, and perhaps a different understanding of what a pyramid could represent. But the deeper mystery is not simply their shape. It is the question that still lingers behind their construction. Who exactly built them in their earliest phase? And how did such a distinctive architectural tradition emerge so suddenly in this region? the conventional archaeological explanation is grounded in cultural exchange. The Kingdom of Kush, centered in Nubia, maintained long-standing contact with Egypt through trade, warfare, intermarriage, and political influence. Egyptian religious concepts, particularly those concerning kingship and the afterlife, were deeply influential. When Kushite rulers adopted pyramid burial practices, they were not copying blindly, but reinterpreting an established funerary tradition through their own cultural lens. In this reading, the builders were local artisans, architects, and laborers working under Nubian kings who sought to align themselves with the prestige of Egyptian royal ideology. The pyramids of Nubia, then, become expressions of cultural adaptation rather than mystery, testaments to a shared but evolving Nile Valley civilization. Yet even within this framework, certain questions remain unsettled. For instance, the earliest Nubian pyramids appear with a level of architectural coherence that suggests a pre-existing conceptual foundation. The rapid emergence of a standardized form, steep angles, consistent orientation, and clustered necropolis planning raises questions about whether there was an earlier, less visible developmental phase that has not yet been fully uncovered. Was this architectural style truly a sudden adoption, or the visible endpoint of a longer, partially lost evolution? At sites like El Kuru, the tombs of early Kushite rulers reveal not only pyramid superstructures, but complex underground burial chambers, painted walls, and ritual layouts that mirror yet also diverge from Egyptian practices. The consistency of certain symbolic elements suggests a shared religious vocabulary. However, the variation in execution hints at independent development rather than direct replication. And so a subtle ambiguity emerges: influence or invention, borrowing or transformation. The question becomes even more intriguing when considering the broader landscape of Nubian history. The region was not a passive recipient of Egyptian culture. It was a dynamic center of its own political and spiritual identity, with deep-rooted traditions stretching back into prehistory. Archaeological evidence indicates complex societies in Nubia long before the rise of pyramid-building kings, including fortified settlements, advanced pottery traditions, and sophisticated burial customs. So, when the pyramids appear, are they truly the beginning of a new architectural tradition, or the visible continuation of something much older, now only partially understood? Some researchers have proposed that early Nubian pyramid construction may have drawn upon indigenous burial mound traditions that predate Egyptian influence. In this interpretation, the pyramid form is not simply imported, but synthesized, an architectural convergence between local funerary practices and external symbolic systems. The steep, pointed shape of Nubian pyramids could reflect an adaptation of earlier mound-based tombs, transformed through exposure to Egyptian stone architects. Architecture. Others suggest a more politically driven explanation. The emergence of pyramids in Nubia coincides with periods of strong Kushite kingship, particularly when rulers sought to assert legitimacy in a region defined by shifting power dynamics. In this view, the pyramids function not only as tombs, but as declarations of authority, visible statements of divine kingship rising from the desert landscape. But even this interpretation does not fully account for the precision and uniformity found across multiple necropolises. At Nuri, for example, the layout of the cemetery suggests deliberate planning on a scale that implies centralized architectural knowledge. The alignment of pyramids, their spacing, and their orientation relative to the Nile and surrounding terrain indicate more than ad hoc construction. They reflect a system, one that understood space, symbolism, and permanence in deeply structured ways. And yet, the identity of the earliest architects behind this system remains partially obscured. We know the names of later Kushite rulers, kings such as those of the Napatan dynasty, who expanded and formalized pyramid construction as a royal tradition. But the transitional moment, when the first pyramids began to rise in Nubia, is less clearly documented. There is a gap between cultural influence and architectural realization, a gap that archaeology continues to attempt to bridge. Within that gap, speculation inevitably begins to form. Some fringe interpretations suggest that the earliest Nubian pyramids may preserve memory fragments of even older architectural knowledge, possibly transmitted orally across generations before being formalized in stone. In this view, the builders were not simply reacting to Egyptian influence, but drawing upon a deeper, more ancient architectural intuition embedded within Nile Valley cultures. Others propose that the sudden clarity of pyramid design in Nubia may reflect the arrival of specialized groups, architects, priests, or artisans, who carried with them knowledge systems that have not been fully traced in the archaeological record. While there is no concrete evidence for such migrations beyond known cultural exchanges, the idea persists in discussions at the margins of academic debate. Still others interpret the pyramids through a symbolic rather than historical lens. The sharp geometry, they argue, may represent not only burial structures, but conceptual models of ascent, physical metaphors for the journey of the soul. In this reading, the builders were not merely constructing tombs, but encoding cosmological beliefs into the landscape itself. Yet even this interpretation circles back to a central uncertainty. Why did this particular form, the pyramid, become such a powerful and recurring expression of meaning across different cultures, regions, and time periods? Is it because the shape itself reflects something universally human in its symbolism of ascent, stability, and permanence? Or does it point to specific cultural transmissions that we have not yet fully reconstructed? As one moves among the ruins of El Kuru or Nuri today, the experience is one of quiet fragmentation. Many of the pyramids are partially collapsed. Their outer casing stones have been stripped or eroded by time. Some chambers have been excavated, others remain buried beneath shifting sands. And yet, even in their incomplete state, the structures retain an unmistakable presence. They feel intentional in a way that resists reduction to simple explanation. Standing before them, one is confronted not only with questions of construction, but of perception. What did these structures mean to the people who built them? Were they seen as gateways, monuments, or something closer to statements written in architectural form? Did the builders imagine their work as part of a larger cosmic order, or as acts grounded in immediate political reality? And perhaps more importantly, did they believe they were the first to do so, or inheritors of something already ancient in their own time? Modern archaeology continues to uncover new fragments, new inscriptions, and new architectural details that refine our understanding of Nubian pyramid construction. Yet each discovery seems to resolve one question only by opening another. The deeper structure of the mystery remains intact, because what we are ultimately looking at is not just a series of tombs, but a tradition emerging at the intersection of memory, influence, innovation, and perhaps lost continuity. The pyramids of Nubia stand as both evidence and question, solid in form, yet uncertain in origin. They anchor the landscape, yet their beginnings remain partially unanchored in history. Continuing from the silent geometry of Nubian pyramids rising from the desert like fragmented thoughts of an ancient world, we now turn toward a symbol that seems to transcend geography altogether, an emblem that appears, reappears, and evolves across civilizations separated by vast distances of time and culture, yet somehow bound by a shared visual language. It begins not in one place, but in many. Carved into sunlit stone reliefs, painted onto temple walls, stamped into royal seals, and etched into metalwork, the image of the winged solar disk emerges again and again. At first glance, it appears simple, a circular disk representing the sun, flanked by outstretched wings, sometimes accompanied by serpents or additional symbolic elements. Yet the more one traces its presence across the ancient world, the more complex it becomes. In the heart of ancient Egypt, this symbol appears prominently above temple entrances, especially in sacred spaces dedicated to divine kingship and protection. The winged disk is often associated with the god Horus in his solar aspect, merging celestial authority with royal legitimacy. In these contexts, the symbol is not merely decorative. It functions as a protective emblem, believed to ward off chaos and maintain cosmic order. High above carved lintels in temples along the Nile, the winged disk spreads its feathers as if hovering eternally between earth and sky. It marks thresholds, places where the ordinary world ends and sacred space begins. One steps beneath it not only physically, but symbolically, entering a domain governed by divine order. But Egypt is only one point in a much wider pattern. To the northeast, in the ancient lands of Mesopotamia, similar imagery appears in royal iconography associated with the god Ashur and later imperial authority. Here, the winged disk is often interpreted as a representation of divine sanction over kingship, a visual declaration that royal power is not merely political, but cosmically endorsed. On palace reliefs from cities such as Nineveh and Khorsabad, the symbol appears above scenes of conquest, ritual, and divine blessing. The disk often contains or is associated with a central figure or abstract representation of divine presence, while the wings extend outward as if enveloping the earthly realm beneath it. And yet, even within Mesopotamia, the symbol is not static. It shifts in form, emphasis, and meaning across time. Sometimes the disk is emphasized. Sometimes the wings dominate. Occasionally, additional elements, such as streamers or serpentine forms, are included, suggesting layers of interpretation that were never fully standardized. This variability raises a fundamental question. Was the winged solar disk ever a single unified symbol, or a family of related ideas expressed through a shared visual vocabulary? As one follows the symbol further outward, it begins to appear in regions even more distant from its apparent centers of origin. Variations of winged solar imagery can be found in Anatolian reliefs, Persian imperial seals, and even later Hellenistic adaptations. In each case, the core structure remains recognizable, a central solar form, flanked by wings or wing-like extensions, often associated with divine or royal authority. In the Achaemenid Persian context, for example, the symbol takes on a more abstract imperial form, often linked to royal legitimacy under the favor of Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity in early Persian religious tradition. Carvings at sites such as Persepolis depict a winged disk above royal figures, reinforcing the idea that kingship is sanctioned from above, literally and symbolically. Yet even here, scholars continue to debate its precise meaning. Is the winged disk a representation of a specific deity, a symbolic abstraction of divine favor, or a visual shorthand for the concept of cosmic order itself? Part of the challenge lies in the symbol's adaptability. Unlike written language, which tends to stabilize meaning through grammar and structure, visual symbols can evolve fluidly across cultures while retaining recognizable form. The winged solar disk appears to function precisely in this way, its core geometry stable enough to be identifiable, but flexible enough to absorb local meaning. And so, the mystery deepens. How did such a specific visual structure become so widespread across civilizations that, in many cases, had limited direct contact? Mainstream scholarship generally explains this through cultural transmission. Trade routes, diplomatic exchanges, military encounters, and shared artistic traditions across the ancient Near East and Mediterranean worlds created channels through which symbols could spread and transform. In this view, the winged solar disk is not evidence of a single origin, but of interconnected civilizations continuously borrowing, adapting, and reinterpreting shared motifs. This explanation is compelling, particularly given the extensive networks of communication that existed across ancient empires. Merchants traveled between Egypt and Mesopotamia. Soldiers moved between Anatolia and the Levant. Craftsmen were often relocated by imperial decree. Ideas, like goods, moved along these pathways. Yet even within this framework, certain questions remain unresolved. Why does the symbol consistently combine three distinct elements, the sun, wings, and central axis, across so many independent cultural contexts? Why does it so often appear in association with rulership, divine authority, and protection, rather than purely astronomical or decorative functions? Some scholars suggest that the symbol reflects a shared cosmological intuition, the sun as a life-giving force, wings as transcendence or movement, and the central axis as divine presence or order. In this interpretation, the winged solar disk becomes less a borrowed motif and more a convergent symbolic solution, different cultures arriving at similar visual expressions for universal ideas. But even this does not fully account for the symbol's persistence and consistency. There are instances where the winged disk appears in contexts that do not neatly align with solar worship or royal iconography. In some cases, it is found in protective amulets, funerary objects, or boundary markers. Its function shifts subtly depending on placement, yet its form remains recognizable. It seems to operate less as a fixed symbol and more as a flexible emblem of authority, protection, and cosmic balance. In ancient Egypt, particularly during the New Kingdom period, the symbol becomes deeply embedded in temple architecture. It is often placed above doorways, as if marking the passage between realms. Entering beneath it may have been understood as passing under divine protection. In this sense, the symbol is not only visual but experiential. It frames movement through sacred space. And yet, despite its ubiquity, the origin of the winged solar disk remains elusive. Was it first conceived in a single cultural center and then transmitted outward? Or did multiple civilizations independently develop similar imagery in response to shared observations of the sun and sky? The latter possibility opens a more intriguing line of thought. Across ancient cultures, the sun is one of the most universal objects of observation. Its movement across the sky, its daily rising and setting, its seasonal variations, all of these phenomena would have demanded interpretation. Wings, as a symbol, often represent movement, transcendence, or divine agency. Combining the two may have been a natural symbolic synthesis, an attempt to represent not just the sun itself, but its perceived motion and influence over the world. In this reading, the winged solar disk is not a single invention, but a recurring symbolic response to a shared human experience of the sky. Yet even if this is true, it does not explain why the symbol becomes so closely tied to authority and kingship across multiple civilizations. Why does the image of the sun with wings so often appear above rulers, temples, and imperial inscriptions? Why does it consistently occupy a position of elevation, hovering above human figures rather than alongside them? Some interpretations suggest that this reflects a broader ancient worldview in which political power was understood as an extension of cosmic order. The ruler was not merely a governing figure, but a participant in maintaining balance between heaven and earth. The winged solar disk, in this sense, becomes a visual guarantee of legitimacy, a declaration that earthly authority is aligned with celestial order. But there are also more speculative interpretations that approach the symbol from different angles. A few researchers outside mainstream academia have proposed that the winged solar disk may preserve traces of even older symbolic systems, possibly predating the civilizations in which it is most commonly found. In this view, the symbol could represent a deeply archaic motif that survived through cultural transmission, adapting to new religious and political frameworks while retaining its essential form. Others suggest that its widespread appearance may reflect not a shared origin, but a shared psychological structure, an innate tendency of the human mind to organize cosmic observation into symmetrical, winged, and circular forms when attempting to represent power, motion, and transcendence simultaneously. Yet none of these explanations fully resolves the tension between similarity and independence, between transmission and convergence. And so the symbol remains suspended in interpretive space. It appears on temple walls in Egypt, carved above royal inscriptions in Mesopotamia, adapted in Persian imperial reliefs, and echoed in later artistic traditions across the ancient world. Each instance is slightly different. Each carries its own cultural weight. And yet, the core image persists with remarkable stability.